The letter should have been burned years ago. Theodore Ashcroft knew that. He had told himself so every winter for 13 years. Yet on a cold October evening in 1864, the folded sheet remained exactly where it had always been, locked inside the top drawer of his desk at Blackthorn House. The wax seal had long since cracked. The edges had yellowed with age. Even so, he could not bring himself to destroy it. Outside, rain whispered against the tall windows overlooking Grosvenor Square. London glowed beneath a veil of mist and lamplight. Carriages rattled over wet cobblestones. Gentlemen hurried beneath black umbrellas. Servants moved quietly through the vast house. None of it held Theodore's attention. His eyes rested on a line written in a familiar hand. "If anything should happen to me, promise you will watch over Charlotte." The words were simple. They always had been. Yet they carried the weight of a vow that had shaped the last 13 years of his life. A knock sounded at the study door. Theodore folded the letter carefully. "Enter." His butler stepped inside. "Your Grace, a message has arrived from Whitmore Hall." Theodore's gaze sharpened instantly. "Is Miss Whitmore well?" "Perfectly well, Your Grace." The butler offered a small envelope. "The housekeeper reports that Miss Whitmore returned safely from the village charity luncheon." Theodore accepted the note. Only after reading every line did the tension leave his shoulders. "Thank you, Barnes." "Will there be anything else, Your Grace?" "No." The butler bowed and withdrew. Silence returned. Theodore looked toward the fire. The flames cast shifting shadows across the room. At 35 years old, Duke Theodore Ashcroft had become one of the most powerful men in England. Parliament listened when he spoke. Landowners sought his approval. Mothers with unmarried daughters practically staged campaigns to secure his attention. Yet none of those things mattered at this particular moment. Charlotte Whitmore had returned home safely. That was enough. Across Yorkshire, nearly 200 miles away, Charlotte Whitmore stood beside a second-floor window at Whitmore Hall and watched the autumn rain streak the glass. The ancient manor sat atop a gentle rise overlooking rolling fields that had belonged to her family for generations. The countryside stretched toward distant hills painted gold and copper by the season. Usually she loved the view. Tonight she barely noticed it. "You are thinking too much again." Charlotte glanced over her shoulder. Mrs. Dawson, her longtime housekeeper, stood in the doorway carrying a silver tray with tea and biscuits. Charlotte smiled faintly. "Is it that obvious?" "Only to people who have known you since you were 10 years old." Mrs. Dawson crossed the room and set the tray on a small table. "Most people would be thrilled to receive an invitation to spend the season in London." Charlotte moved toward the fire. "Most people are not me. Most people are not 22 years old and hiding in Yorkshire when half the kingdom is searching for suitable husbands." Charlotte laughed softly. "That sounds exhausting." "Marriage often is." The older woman smiled. "Still, you cannot remain here forever." Charlotte lowered herself into a chair. She knew Mrs. Dawson was right. Since reaching adulthood, invitations had arrived with increasing frequency. Dinners, house parties, charity events, social gatherings. Every year she found new reasons to decline. Part of her preferred the peace of Whitmore Hall. Part of her dreaded becoming another young lady displayed before London's marriage-minded society. "His Grace believes it is time." Mrs. Dawson added the comment casually. Charlotte immediately rolled her eyes. "Uncle Theo believes many things. He is not actually your uncle." "I know that." Charlotte reached for her teacup. "But I have called him Uncle Theo since I was 9 years old. It would feel strange to stop now." Mrs. Dawson gave her a knowing look. Charlotte pretended not to notice. In truth, Theodore Ashcroft had never encouraged the nickname. Nor had he objected to it. He simply endured it with the same calm restraint he brought to everything else. Charlotte remembered the first time they met. Her father had introduced the towering young Duke as his closest friend. Charlotte had hidden behind a chair and refused to speak. Theodore had knelt beside her and offered a small carved horse from his pocket. She still had it. Somewhere. After that day she began calling him Uncle Theo. The name remained. Even after her father's death. Even after Theodore became her legal guardian. Even after she grew old enough to understand that he was not family at all. You should be grateful, Mrs. Dawson said gently. Not every young lady has someone looking after her interests. Charlotte's expression softened. I am grateful. And she was. Theodore had always fulfilled every obligation. He ensured Whitmore Hall remained financially secure. He oversaw investments. He reviewed legal matters. He arranged tutors when she was younger. Every Christmas brought gifts. Every birthday brought flowers. Every major decision received his attention. Yet despite all that, a curious distance remained between them. Theodore visited only a few times each year. His letters were polite. Formal. Careful. Sometimes Charlotte wondered if he saw her as a responsibility rather than a person. The thought always left an uncomfortable ache she could never fully explain. You are frowning again, Mrs. Dawson observed. Charlotte smiled. Perhaps I inherited the habit from Uncle Theo. The man was born frowning. That is unfair. True. Mrs. Dawson chuckled. He occasionally looks irritated instead. Their laughter faded into comfortable silence. Outside, rain continued falling across the Yorkshire countryside. Charlotte watched droplets race down the windowpane. Soon she would travel to London. Soon she would enter a world of grand ballrooms, glittering chandeliers, whispered gossip, and endless expectations. The idea filled her with equal parts excitement and dread. Several days later, a black carriage bearing the Ashcroft crest rolled through the gates of Whitmore Hall. Charlotte spotted it from the library window. Her heart lifted before she could stop it. He is here. She set aside her book and hurried into the corridor. Servants moved toward the entrance hall. Footsteps echoed through the house. By the time Charlotte reached the staircase, the front doors had opened. Theodore Ashcroft stepped inside. He looked exactly as she remembered. Tall. Broad-shouldered. Impeccably dressed. Rain glistened across his dark coat. A few silver threads touched his hair near the temples. They somehow made him appear even more distinguished. Charlotte descended the staircase quickly. Uncle Theo. Theodore turned. For an instant something warm flickered across his face. It disappeared so quickly she almost imagined it. Charlotte. You arrived without warning. I sent notice yesterday. Then the notice must still be traveling. A hint of amusement touched his eyes. Apparently. Charlotte reached the bottom step. She realized with surprise that she now had to tilt her head farther than before to meet his gaze. Perhaps because she was no longer 16. Perhaps because time had passed more quickly than either of them expected. How was your journey? She asked. Uneventful. Then it must have been disappointing. Theodore's mouth twitched slightly. You continue to say whatever enters your mind. Someone should. Society may disagree. Charlotte smiled. Fortunately, society is not here. For a moment neither spoke. The familiar ease of childhood felt different now. Not gone. Simply altered in ways Charlotte could not define. Theodore seemed aware of it too. His posture grew slightly more formal. His gaze shifted briefly toward the servants before returning to her. You look well. That is a very Duke-like compliment. What would be a less Duke-like compliment? Charlotte considered. Perhaps that my hair does not resemble a haystack today. Theodore glanced at her hair. Your hair has never resembled a haystack. The answer emerged so quickly that Charlotte blinked. A strange silence followed. Theodore looked faintly annoyed with himself. Charlotte suddenly became aware of her own heartbeat. Mrs. Dawson appeared as if summoned by destiny itself. Your Grace. We have prepared your usual room. Theodore stepped back. The moment vanished. Thank you. Charlotte watched him follow the housekeeper down the corridor. Something about the exchange lingered in her thoughts long afterward. That evening the family dined together in the small formal dining room. Candlelight reflected from polished silver. Rain tapped softly against the windows. Conversation flowed more easily than Charlotte expected. Theodore asked about the estate, her studies, the tenant families, her charitable projects. He listened with genuine attention. Yet every time the discussion drifted toward London, something changed. A subtle tension appeared behind his calm expression. Finally Charlotte set down her fork. You disapprove? Theodore looked up. Of what? The season. I did not say that. You did not need to. Theodore regarded her steadily. You are 22 years old. Last I checked. Most young ladies spend their seasons in London. That sounds suspiciously like approval. He ignored the comment. You should have opportunities. Opportunities to do what? Meet people. Charlotte smiled mischievously. You mean husbands? Theodore's expression became unreadable. Among others. She expected him to continue. He did not. The silence felt oddly heavy. Charlotte could not understand why. Later that night, long after the household retired, Theodore stood alone in the library. Moonlight filtered through the windows. The room smelled faintly of leather and old books. He opened a locked drawer hidden behind a shelf. Inside rested dozens of letters tied with ribbon. Every one belonged to Charlotte. Notes she had written over the years. Childhood observations. Birthday messages. Casual updates. Invitations. Thank you cards. Theodore picked up the oldest. The paper was worn from handling. Dear Uncle Theo, today I learned how to ride without falling off. I only frightened the horse twice. A faint smile touched his face. He remembered the day clearly. He remembered far too many things. More than he should. Footsteps sounded outside the library. Theodore returned the letters to their place and locked the drawer. Moments later Barnes appeared in the doorway. Your Grace. Theodore turned. What is it? A message arrived from London. Barnes handed him a folded note. Theodore opened it. His expression hardened instantly. The message contained only a few lines. Someone has begun asking questions about Miss Whitmore's inheritance. Exercise caution. Theodore read the words twice. Then a third time. The warmth from earlier vanished completely. Across the hall, Charlotte slept peacefully in her room, unaware that old secrets had begun stirring once again. Unaware that promises made 13 years ago were about to be tested. And unaware that the man she still called Uncle Theo had already decided there was nothing he would not do to keep her safe. Morning sunlight spilled across the breakfast room at Whitmore Hall, turning the silver tea service into pools of gold. Charlotte sat near the window with a letter in one hand and a piece of toast forgotten on her plate. The words on the page were perfectly polite. They were also perfectly irritating. You are staring at that letter as though it insulted your family. Mrs. Dawson poured more tea. Charlotte looked up. It is from Lady Winthrop. Ah. The older woman immediately understood. How many invitations has she sent this year? 4. Then she is clearly determined. Charlotte folded the letter. She wishes me to attend a hunting party next week. And? I do not hunt. Neither do half the young ladies who attend such events. Charlotte sighed dramatically. Then why attend? Mrs. Dawson smiled over the rim of her teacup. To be seen. That sounds dreadful. The housekeeper laughed softly. You have spent too much time in Yorkshire. Charlotte glanced toward the door. Theodore had already departed before sunrise to inspect several tenant properties. He had left a brief note wishing her a pleasant morning. The message contained exactly one sentence. It was typical of him. Thoughtful. Efficient. Impossible to interpret. Her gaze drifted toward the gardens beyond the window. Autumn had painted the estate in rich shades of amber and crimson. Leaves drifted across the lawns whenever the wind stirred. In another month winter would arrive. Then London. Then an entirely different life. The thought should have excited her. Instead it left her uneasy. By noon the sky had cleared. Charlotte escaped outdoors with a book tucked beneath one arm. The fresh air felt wonderful after several days of rain. She wandered toward the eastern fields where a narrow path wound between hedgerows and rolling pastureland. Whitmore Hall had always felt less like a house and more like a world unto itself. Every hill carried memories. Every tree seemed connected to some forgotten childhood adventure. As she walked, she found herself thinking about Theodore again. It happened more often lately. Perhaps because he was visiting. Perhaps because London approached. Or perhaps because she had begun noticing things she once ignored. The distance in his eyes. The careful formality. The strange way he sometimes looked at her as though remembering something far away. Charlotte stopped beneath a large oak tree. Beyond the next rise stood the old riding meadow. She had not visited it in years. A smile tugged at her lips. She could still remember the humiliation of falling off her first horse there. At 12 years old she had been determined to prove herself an expert rider. Reality disagreed. The memory arrived with surprising clarity. The bright summer sun. The stubborn mare. The certainty that she could handle everything without assistance. Then the sudden loss of balance. The terrifying rush toward the ground. Charlotte remembered the impact. She remembered embarrassment far more vividly than pain. Most of all she remembered Theodore. He had appeared almost immediately. One moment she was sprawled in the grass trying not to cry. The next he was beside her. "Are you injured?" he had asked. Charlotte, stubborn even then, had shaken her head. No. Theodore had looked unconvinced. Charlotte. Maybe a little. A little. Perhaps more than a little. His expression had remained serious. Yet she remembered the concern in his eyes. The way he examined her scraped hands. The way he stayed beside her until the estate physician arrived. At the time she assumed it was coincidence. Theodore happened to be visiting. He happened to be nearby. Nothing more. Charlotte resumed walking. The memory left her strangely warm. Half an hour later she reached the meadow itself. The landscape had changed very little. Wind swept across the open grass. Clouds drifted lazily overhead. She lowered herself onto a fallen log and opened her book. The peaceful silence lasted approximately 10 minutes. Then she heard hoofbeats. Charlotte looked up. A rider approached from the western edge of the field. Theodore guided his dark horse across the meadow with effortless control. He spotted her immediately. "There you are." Charlotte closed her book. "Were you searching for me?" "The housekeeper mentioned your destination." "That sounds suspiciously close to searching." Theodore dismounted. "You are alone." "I am reading." "Alone?" Charlotte laughed. "I am beginning to suspect you disapprove of independence." Theodore tethered his horse nearby. "I approve of common sense. And reading beneath an oak tree lacks common sense. Walking several miles from the house without an escort does." Charlotte opened her mouth to argue. Then she stopped. "You sound exactly like my father." Something flickered across Theodore's face. The expression vanished so quickly she almost missed it. "Your father often spoke wisely." Charlotte softened. "I miss him." Theodore's gaze shifted toward the distant hills. "So do I." Silence settled between them. Comfortable. Familiar. Yet beneath it Charlotte sensed something deeper. Something neither of them discussed. A breeze stirred the leaves overhead. Theodore glanced at the book in her lap. "What are you reading?" Charlotte held up the volume. "Poetry." "Dangerous." "How?" "It encourages unrealistic expectations." Charlotte smiled. And what encourages realistic expectations? Estate ledgers. She laughed. Theodore looked faintly pleased by the sound. The moment lingered longer than it should have. Eventually he mounted his horse again. Try not to wander farther. Charlotte lifted an eyebrow. Was that an order? A request? You are becoming softer with age. Theodore shook his head. An unfortunate rumor. He rode away before she could answer. Charlotte watched until he disappeared beyond the rise. For reasons she could not explain, the afternoon suddenly felt brighter. Several days later, preparations for London accelerated. Dressmakers arrived. Trunks appeared. Invitations accumulated. Every room in Whitmore Hall seemed consumed by activity. Charlotte escaped the chaos whenever possible. One crisp afternoon she borrowed a carriage and travelled to a nearby village to deliver supplies for the church charity fund. The journey should have been entirely routine. Instead it became one of those memories that refused to fade. The road curved through wooded countryside a few miles from the estate. Sunlight filtered through golden leaves. Charlotte sat comfortably inside the carriage reading correspondence. Without warning, the vehicle lurched. The coachman called out. The horses became restless. Charlotte grabbed the seat to steady herself. The carriage slowed abruptly. Then stopped. Her heart hammered. What happened? She called. The coachman appeared outside moments later. Nothing serious, miss. One wheel has come loose. Charlotte released a breath. Can it be repaired? Yes, miss. It will take some time. Charlotte nodded. The situation was inconvenient but hardly alarming. Then another carriage appeared on the road. A large black carriage bearing a familiar crest. Charlotte stared through the window. You cannot be serious. The second vehicle halted nearby. Moments later Theodore stepped onto the road. Charlotte climbed down from her own carriage. Uncle Theo. Theodore approached. Are you hurt? No. Certain. Quite certain. His gaze moved briefly over the damaged wheel. Good. Charlotte folded her arms. How did you know I was here? Theodore answered too quickly. I happened to be passing. Charlotte looked around. The road stretched through miles of countryside. Passing? Yes. In the middle of nowhere. Theodore remained perfectly composed. There are several tenant farms nearby. Charlotte studied him suspiciously. You have the most remarkable timing of anyone I know. An admirable quality. Or a suspicious one. A hint of amusement appeared in his eyes. If you prefer, I can leave. You know perfectly well I do not. The words escaped before she could stop them. A strange silence followed. Theodore looked at her. Charlotte suddenly found the road extremely interesting. After a moment he spoke. My carriage has room. It will be more comfortable than waiting beside a broken wheel. Charlotte glanced toward the damaged vehicle. That is probably true. Theodore offered his hand to assist her. The gesture was ordinary. Entirely proper. Yet for reasons she could not understand, Charlotte became acutely aware of it. She placed her gloved hand in his. His grip was steady and brief. Nothing more. Even so, her pulse behaved oddly for several seconds afterward. The remainder of the journey passed pleasantly. They discussed estate matters. Books. Village improvements. Everything except the increasingly obvious question of why Theodore seemed to appear whenever trouble found her. That evening Charlotte mentioned the incident during dinner. Mrs. Dawson listened with growing amusement. You seem surprised. Should I not be? Charlotte asked. The carriage breaks down. Theodore appears. Again. Again? Charlotte nodded. The horse accident years ago. The carriage today. There have been others. She paused. Now that I think about it, Uncle Theo always seems nearby whenever something goes wrong. Mrs. Dawson exchanged a brief glance with the elderly butler standing near the sideboard. The look lasted less than a second. Charlotte almost missed it. Almost. What was that? She asked immediately. What was what? Mrs. Dawson replied. That look. You imagined things. Charlotte narrowed her eyes. The housekeeper sipped her tea. The butler suddenly found the silverware fascinating. Neither volunteered further information. Later that night, Charlotte stood alone beside her bedroom window. Moonlight illuminated the gardens below. Somewhere within the house a clock struck 10. She thought again about the carriage. About the riding accident years ago. About dozens of smaller moments she had never connected before. Times Theodore arrived unexpectedly. Times problems resolved themselves. Times assistance appeared precisely when needed. A ridiculous thought entered her mind. She dismissed it immediately. Then it returned. What if none of it had been coincidence? Charlotte shook her head. The idea was absurd. And yet, as she prepared for bed, she found herself wondering. Downstairs, in a quiet office near the rear of the house, Theodore reviewed estate documents beneath the glow of an oil lamp. A discreet knock sounded at the door. Enter. The elderly butler stepped inside. Your Grace. Theodore looked up. What is it? Miss Whitmore has begun asking questions. Theodore's expression remained calm. About? Your timing. Silence filled the room. The butler continued carefully. She remembers more than we expected. Theodore leaned back in his chair. For several moments he said nothing. Finally he closed the ledger before him. Then we must be more careful. The butler hesitated. Do you believe she suspects anything? Theodore glanced toward the dark window. Somewhere above them Charlotte slept peacefully, unaware of the network of loyal people who had quietly watched over her for years. No, he said at last. Not yet. But as the words left his mouth, he realized something unsettling. Charlotte was no longer a child. And secrets that had remained hidden for 13 years were becoming increasingly difficult to keep. The first order had been signed 13 years ago. The ink had faded. The paper had yellowed. Yet the instructions remained as clear as the day they were written. Protect Miss Charlotte Whitmore. Report any concerns immediately. Theodore Ashcroft looked down at the document spread across his desk in Blackthorn House's temporary study at Whitmore Hall. Several other papers surrounded it. Reports. Correspondence. Receipts. Names. Dates. Details collected quietly over more than a decade. Anyone else would have seen ordinary estate records. Theodore knew better. Every page represented a promise. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Enter. Barnes stepped inside carrying a leather folder. The latest reports, Your Grace. Theodore accepted them without comment. The butler hesitated. There is something else. Theodore looked up. Go on. Miss Whitmore spent part of yesterday questioning Mrs. Dawson. Theodore was not surprised. About me? Indirectly. Barnes chose his words carefully. She has begun noticing certain patterns. Theodore opened the folder. Inside were reports from London, Yorkshire, and several neighbouring counties. Some concerned estate business. Others did not. His expression remained calm. She was always observant. Barnes allowed himself a small smile. That she was. Theodore turned a page. A note from a retired military officer. Another from a solicitor in York. A third from an old family friend. Different handwriting. Different locations. The same purpose. They all watched over Charlotte in one way or another. None of them knew the full story. Only Theodore did. Continue as before, he said. No changes. Barnes inclined his head. Very good, Your Grace. After the butler left, Theodore sat in silence for several moments. Outside, wind rattled branches against the windows. Autumn deepened with every passing day. Soon they would leave for London. Soon Charlotte would step into a world far more complicated than the peaceful countryside she loved. The thought unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Across the hall, Charlotte was completely unaware that her life had become the subject of discussion once again. She sat in the morning room surrounded by invitation cards. There seemed to be hundreds of them. Dinner parties, musical evenings, charity galas, garden receptions, house parties. Every event carried the same unspoken purpose: marriage. Charlotte sighed and dropped another card onto the growing pile. You look as though you are preparing for a military campaign. Mrs. Dawson settled into a nearby chair. I believe military campaigns might be simpler. Nonsense. Charlotte held up a cream-colored invitation. This one requires 3 different outfits. Society has standards. Society has entirely too much free time. Mrs. Dawson laughed. You say that now. Wait until you arrive in London. Charlotte leaned back in her chair. Everyone seems convinced I will enjoy it. Perhaps because you might. Or perhaps because everyone else enjoys making decisions for me. The housekeeper raised an eyebrow. Including His Grace. Charlotte opened her mouth. Then stopped. That is different. How? Charlotte considered the question. Theodore had been making decisions connected to her welfare for most of her life. Somehow it felt natural. Expected. Safe. She trusted him in ways she trusted almost no one else. The realization arrived so easily that it startled her. I suppose because he has always been there, she said quietly. Mrs. Dawson's expression softened. Yes. Charlotte looked toward the window. Even when I was younger. Memories drifted through her mind. Some vivid. Some faint. A rainy afternoon at boarding school. A winter illness. A lost necklace recovered under mysterious circumstances. Tiny moments she had forgotten for years. Looking back, Theodore seemed connected to all of them. At the time she never questioned it. Now she found herself wondering. Later that afternoon she wandered through the western wing of Whitmore Hall searching for an old sketchbook. The rarely used rooms remained largely unchanged from her childhood. Dust danced in shafts of sunlight. Portraits watched from paneled walls. The house carried its history proudly. Charlotte opened doors one after another. Most contained nothing of interest. Eventually she found herself near a small sitting room she had not entered in years. Curiosity drew her inside. The room overlooked the gardens. Faded floral wallpaper covered the walls. An old writing desk stood near the window. Charlotte smiled. She remembered this place. She used to spend hours here as a child. Drawing. Reading. Pretending she lived inside adventure novels. Her gaze drifted toward a cabinet in the corner. Something about it seemed familiar. She crossed the room and opened it. Inside sat several forgotten boxes. One contained ribbons. Another held old books. A third contained childhood treasures she had not seen in years. Charlotte laughed softly. There was the carved wooden horse Theodore had given her when they first met. There was a faded ribbon from a village fair. There were pressed flowers and handwritten notes. She lifted the horse carefully. Time had smoothed the edges. Yet she remembered that day perfectly. She had been frightened after meeting so many unfamiliar adults. Theodore had somehow understood without her saying a word. You always know what to do, she murmured. The comment slipped out before she realized it. A strange warmth filled her chest. Before she could examine the feeling too closely, footsteps approached. Charlotte turned. Theodore stood in the doorway. For a moment neither spoke. His gaze moved from her face to the wooden horse in her hand. Something unexpectedly tender appeared in his expression. You still have that? Charlotte smiled. Of course. Theodore stepped into the room. I assumed it disappeared years ago. I kept it. She glanced around. Apparently I keep everything. A quiet laugh escaped him. The sound was rare enough to catch her completely off guard. Charlotte stared. Theodore immediately became aware of it. What? He asked. You laughed. I occasionally do. I am not convinced. The corner of his mouth lifted. A dangerous accusation. Charlotte looked at him for a moment longer than necessary. The room suddenly felt smaller. Warmer. Different. She could not explain why. Theodore seemed equally aware of the shift. His attention moved toward the window. You should finish preparing. For London? Yes. Charlotte groaned dramatically. There it is again. What? That certainty that I must go. Theodore studied her. You cannot spend your life hiding in Yorkshire. I am not hiding. No. Perhaps only a little. Theodore's expression softened. Charlotte. Her name sounded different when he said it. More serious somehow. You deserve a life beyond these walls. Charlotte looked away first. The sincerity in his voice affected her more than it should have. That evening, after dinner, Theodore met with several members of the estate staff in a private office. The gathering appeared ordinary. Discussions of accounts. Property maintenance. Tenant concerns. Yet after the others departed, one man remained behind. He was older, broad-shouldered, and dressed like a steward. His name was Arthur Hale. Most people knew him as an estate manager. Very few knew anything more. Theodore closed the ledger on his desk. Report. Arthur nodded. Nothing concerning in Yorkshire. And London? Several inquiries continue. Theodore's expression hardened slightly. From whom? Mostly fortune hunters. Arthur paused. One name appears more frequently than the others. Theodore waited. Gregory Whitmore. Silence filled the room. Gregory Whitmore. Charlotte's uncle. A man Theodore neither trusted nor respected. What does he want? Theodore asked. Arthur exhaled slowly. Information about her inheritance. Theodore rose from his chair and crossed toward the window. Outside, darkness covered the estate. Lamps glowed warmly in distant windows. Somewhere upstairs Charlotte was probably reading before bed. Completely unaware. Arthur watched him carefully. Do you wish me to continue monitoring the situation? Theodore answered without hesitation. Yes. Understood. Arthur moved toward the door. Then paused. There is one more thing. Theodore turned. What? Arthur smiled faintly. Miss Whitmore asked the gardener this morning whether anyone had ever been instructed to watch over her. Theodore stared. Arthur's smile widened slightly. The gardener denied everything. A long silence followed. Then Theodore shook his head. She notices too much. She always has. After Arthur left, Theodore remained by the window for several minutes. His reflection stared back from the glass. The years had changed many things. Responsibilities. Expectations. Circumstances. One thing had never changed. The promise. Yet lately the promise felt more complicated than it once had. Much more complicated. Upstairs, Charlotte sat beside the fire with a book open in her lap. She had not turned a page in nearly 15 minutes. Her thoughts kept returning to the same question. Why did Theodore always seem to know when she needed help? The answer remained frustratingly out of reach. Eventually she rose and crossed toward the window. Moonlight silvered the gardens below. The estate slept peacefully. Then she noticed movement. A man crossed the courtyard carrying a lantern. Another followed moments later. They exchanged brief words before disappearing into the darkness. Perfectly ordinary. Yet something about it sparked an idea. Not a complete idea. Merely the beginning of one. Charlotte stood very still. For the first time, she considered a possibility she had never entertained before. What if Theodore's appearances were not accidents? What if someone had been watching over her all along? The thought should have sounded ridiculous. Instead, it felt unsettlingly plausible. And somewhere else within the house, locked inside a desk drawer hidden from everyone, rested 13 years of reports proving that her suspicion was far closer to the truth than she could possibly imagine. London announced itself long before Charlotte Whitmore saw it. The city revealed its presence through noise first. The distant rumble of carriage wheels. The endless movement of people. The constant hum of life that never seemed to sleep. Then came the smell of coal fires drifting through the autumn air. Finally, the sprawling rows of elegant townhouses appeared beyond the carriage window. Charlotte pressed her fingertips lightly against the glass. "It is larger than I remember." Mrs. Dawson smiled from the opposite seat. "Everything feels larger when one returns as an adult." Charlotte suspected that was true. Her last extended visit to London had been years ago. At the time she had viewed the city through a child's eyes. Now every detail seemed sharper. More complicated. More intimidating. Their carriage turned into Grosvenor Square and approached Blackthorn House. The imposing residence occupied one of the most desirable locations in Mayfair. Tall windows reflected the pale afternoon sunlight. Polished stone gleamed. Liveried footmen waited near the entrance. Charlotte felt a familiar mixture of comfort and nervousness. Theodore's London home had always welcomed her. Yet this visit felt different. Almost everything did lately. Before the carriage fully stopped, the front doors opened. Theodore descended the steps. Charlotte's pulse performed an entirely unreasonable movement. She immediately blamed the journey. Nothing else. Absolutely nothing else. The footman opened the carriage door. Theodore offered his hand. "Welcome to London." Charlotte accepted the assistance. "You make it sound as though you personally own the city." "Only several streets." "How modest of you." The faintest hint of amusement appeared in his eyes. Charlotte noticed it immediately. She seemed to notice everything about him lately. That realization unsettled her enough that she quickly looked away. The household staff greeted her warmly. Rooms had already been prepared. Fresh flowers decorated her suite. Her favorite books rested on a table near the fireplace. Every detail reflected careful attention. Charlotte should not have been surprised. Theodore remembered things most people overlooked. The realization brought unexpected warmth to her chest. The following morning began with fittings. Then more fittings. Followed by additional fittings apparently designed by society to test human endurance. By noon, Charlotte was convinced that dressmakers secretly ruled England. Mrs. Dawson disagreed. "You say that now. Wait until the invitations begin." Charlotte collapsed onto a sofa. "There are more invitations. Hundreds. That is horrifying." The housekeeper laughed. "You will survive." Charlotte was not entirely convinced. Several hours later she escaped into the library seeking refuge among books. The room occupied the rear portion of Blackthorn House. Floor-to-ceiling shelves lined the walls. Afternoon sunlight spilled through tall windows overlooking a private garden. It was exactly the sort of place Charlotte loved. She selected a volume and settled into a chair. Peace lasted approximately 20 minutes. Then a masculine voice interrupted her concentration. "Miss Whitmore." Charlotte looked up. A young gentleman stood near the doorway. He appeared perhaps 28 years old. Well-dressed. Respectable. Handsome in the polished manner favored by London society. "Forgive the interruption," he said. "I did not realize the room was occupied." Charlotte closed her book. "Not at all." The gentleman bowed. Edward Langley. The name sounded familiar. Charlotte recalled hearing it during breakfast. A family connection of some sort. Charlotte Whitmore. "I know." He smiled. "Your arrival has been discussed extensively." Charlotte groaned softly. That cannot be a good sign. Mr. Langley laughed. Quite the opposite. He hesitated. May I join you? Charlotte nodded politely. The conversation that followed proved surprisingly pleasant. Mr. Langley possessed intelligence, humor, and a refreshing lack of arrogance. They discussed literature, travel, local charities. Several times Charlotte forgot she was participating in the sort of social interaction everyone had insisted she needed. Then the library door opened again. Theodore entered. Charlotte felt his presence before she consciously registered it. The reaction irritated her immediately. Theodore paused. His gaze moved from Charlotte to Mr. Langley. Something subtle shifted in his expression. Not displeasure exactly. Not approval either. Merely careful observation. Your Grace, Mr. Langley said. Theodore inclined his head. Langley. Charlotte looked between them. Do you know each other? For many years, Theodore replied. His father manages several parliamentary interests. Then perhaps I should be careful what I say. Mr. Langley grinned. An excellent strategy. The conversation continued. Yet Charlotte gradually became aware of something peculiar. Theodore contributed very little. Instead he watched. Listened. Evaluated. The realization unsettled her. Why should it matter whether Theodore approved of her conversation partner? The answer arrived before she could stop it. Because somehow it did matter. Much more than it should. Eventually Mr. Langley excused himself. Once the door closed, silence settled across the library. Charlotte returned her attention to the book in her lap. Or pretended to. Theodore remained standing nearby. He seems pleasant, she said. He is. Charlotte waited. Theodore offered nothing further. That is all. What more would you like? Charlotte looked up. Most guardians interrogate potential acquaintances. Langley requires no interrogation. Because? Because I already know him. Charlotte studied him. Something about the answer irritated her unexpectedly. Convenient. Theodore folded his arms. You appear disappointed. Do I? Yes. Charlotte stood and crossed toward a shelf. Perhaps I expected a lecture. Would that make you happier? No. Theodore's gaze followed her movement. Good. The simple exchange should have ended there. Instead, a curious tension lingered. Neither seemed eager to leave. Charlotte selected a random book she had no intention of reading. Theodore remained near the fireplace. The silence grew longer. Stranger. Finally Charlotte spoke. Do you ever regret it? Theodore frowned slightly. Regret what? Becoming responsible for me. The question escaped before she could reconsider. Theodore went completely still. The change was immediate enough to startle her. No. The answer arrived without hesitation. Charlotte looked down at the book in her hands. You answered very quickly. Because the answer is simple. She lifted her gaze. Theodore's expression had softened in a way she rarely saw. I have never regretted it. Something inside her chest tightened unexpectedly. Neither spoke for several moments. Charlotte became acutely aware of every detail. The afternoon light. The quiet room. The sound of distant carriage wheels outside. Theodore's steady gaze. Suddenly she remembered that he was not merely her guardian. Not merely her father's friend. He was a man. A very distinguished man. A very powerful man. A very handsome man. The realization arrived with alarming force. Charlotte immediately wished it would leave. Unfortunately, it appeared determined to remain. Theodore seemed aware that something had shifted. His posture changed almost imperceptibly. His expression grew more reserved. More careful. You should rest before tonight's dinner. Charlotte blinked. Tonight? The Hartwell reception. She groaned. I had forgotten. An impressive achievement. Can I remain here with my books instead? No. You are remarkably unsympathetic. Theodore almost smiled. I have been told that before. That evening London society gathered beneath glittering chandeliers and enough candlelight to illuminate half the city. The Hartwell residence overflowed with aristocrats, politicians, military officers, and ambitious mothers. Charlotte entered on Theodore's arm. Conversation seemed to pause. Not entirely. Just enough to notice. Charlotte felt dozens of curious eyes turn toward her. This is dreadful, she murmured. You are doing fine. Theodore's voice remained calm. Everyone is staring. Everyone always stares. At me. At everything. Charlotte suspected he was attempting reassurance. The effort somehow made her smile. Throughout the evening introductions followed introductions. Charlotte met countesses, barons, viscounts, members of parliament, distinguished widows, eligible bachelors. The endless stream of names blurred together. Yet one detail remained constant. Theodore never strayed far. Sometimes he crossed the ballroom. Sometimes he joined another conversation. Somehow he always remained within sight. Charlotte noticed. More importantly, she noticed herself noticing. That realization proved far more troubling. Later she stood beside a refreshment table speaking with several young ladies when laughter erupted nearby. One woman lowered her voice. That is Miss Whitmore. Another followed her gaze. The Duke's ward? Yes. Charlotte pretended not to hear. Years of practice made the skill easy. I understand she spent most of her life hidden away in Yorkshire. How unfortunate. Or strategic. More laughter followed. Charlotte's smile remained perfectly composed. Inside, irritation stirred. Before she could decide whether to leave, a familiar voice spoke behind her. Miss Whitmore. The group immediately fell silent. Theodore approached. Every lady present seemed suddenly fascinated by his existence. Charlotte resisted the urge to laugh. Your Grace. Theodore offered his arm. Lord Pembroke wishes to meet you. The invitation was entirely ordinary. Yet Charlotte noticed something else. Theodore's timing. Again. He had arrived precisely when needed. Exactly as he always seemed to. As they walked away, she glanced up at him. How did you know? Theodore looked down. Know what? That I required rescuing. A brief pause followed. Experience. Charlotte laughed softly. Theodore did not. His attention remained fixed on the crowd ahead. For a fleeting moment she wondered whether the answer contained more truth than either of them acknowledged. Across the ballroom another gentleman watched Charlotte with obvious interest. Tall. Well-connected. Ambitious. Theodore noticed immediately. The man began moving in their direction. Charlotte remained unaware. Theodore's expression became unreadable. Somewhere deep within him an uncomfortable realization continued growing. One he had been avoiding for months. Perhaps years. Charlotte was no longer a child. London would ensure everyone noticed. And for the first time, Theodore found himself wishing they would not. By the second week of the season, Charlotte had reached an uncomfortable conclusion. London possessed an extraordinary talent for exhausting people while pretending to entertain them. Every day seemed filled with obligations. Breakfast invitations became luncheon engagements. Luncheon engagements transformed into afternoon calls. Afternoon calls led inevitably toward dinners, musicales, charity events, or grand evening receptions. The city never stopped moving. Neither, apparently, did society. Charlotte stood beside a ballroom window at Lady Ashcombe's spring gala and watched dozens of couples glide across the polished floor. Crystal chandeliers cast golden light over silk gowns and black evening coats. Laughter drifted through the room. A string orchestra played softly from an elevated gallery. Everything looked elegant. Everything felt exhausting. "You are hiding." Charlotte glanced sideways. Edward Langley appeared beside her carrying 2 glasses of lemonade. Observing, she corrected. "There is a difference. Not from this distance." He handed her a glass. Charlotte accepted it gratefully. "You have become alarmingly good at finding me. You always stand near windows. Fresh air. Escape routes." Charlotte laughed. "Perhaps both." Edward smiled. He had become one of her most frequent companions during recent weeks. His easy nature placed people at ease. Unlike many gentlemen, he never seemed interested in impressing anyone. Charlotte appreciated that. They discussed books, local politics, and occasionally exchanged observations about the absurdities of society. The friendship felt natural. Comfortable. Unfortunately, comfort did not protect her from gossip. It rarely protected anyone in London. Across the ballroom, 2 young women stood near a marble column. Charlotte did not know either of them personally. Their voices remained low. Their eyes did not. "There she is." "Miss Whitmore." "Yes." "The Duke's ward?" Charlotte pretended not to hear. Experience had taught her that pretending often worked better than responding. Unfortunately, the conversation continued. "I heard she spent most of her life hidden away in Yorkshire." "That explains a great deal." Soft laughter followed. Edward's jaw tightened slightly. Charlotte noticed. Do not what?" "Look offended on my behalf." Edward exhaled. "They are being rude. Then they are participating in a beloved London tradition." He studied her carefully. "You are accustomed to this." Charlotte looked back toward the dancers. "More than I wish to be." The truth was simple. Ever since arriving in London, she had sensed it. The whispers. The curiosity. The assumptions. Some viewed her as fortunate because Theodore Ashcroft served as her guardian. Others viewed her as an outsider who had somehow wandered into elite society through borrowed influence. Neither perspective felt accurate. Yet society rarely cared about accuracy. It preferred stories. And Charlotte had become one. "People are curious," Edward said gently. Charlotte smiled faintly. "That is a polite way to describe gossip." Before he could answer, another voice joined them. "Miss Whitmore." Charlotte turned. Lady Victoria Holloway stood nearby. She was beautiful in the polished way society admired. Dark hair. Perfect posture. Impeccable fashion. Charlotte knew her by reputation long before they formally met. Victoria belonged to an old aristocratic family. More importantly, she had spent years appearing wherever Theodore happened to be. "Lady Victoria." Charlotte offered a polite smile. Victoria returned one of equal politeness. The kind that never reached the eyes. "I hope you are enjoying London." "Very much." "Wonderful." Victoria glanced briefly toward Edward. "Though I imagine the transition from Yorkshire must be challenging." Charlotte recognized the remark immediately. It sounded pleasant. It was not. Edward recognized it as well. "Miss Whitmore appears to be managing exceptionally well." Victoria's smile remained unchanged. "I am certain she is." Charlotte felt irritation stir. Not because of the comment itself. Because she suddenly understood what it represented. Victoria did not see her as an equal. She saw her as a temporary curiosity. Someone tolerated because of Theodore. Someone beneath consideration. The realization should not have mattered. Yet somehow it did. Victoria inclined her head and moved away. Edward watched her leave. That was unpleasant. Charlotte exhaled slowly. "Welcome to London." The evening continued. So did the whispers. They appeared everywhere. At dinners. At musicales. At charity functions. Sometimes Charlotte overheard them directly. Sometimes she merely noticed conversations ending when she approached. The pattern became impossible to ignore. One afternoon she attended a garden gathering hosted by a countess in Belgravia. Dozens of guests strolled among carefully arranged flower beds. Servants circulated with refreshments. The atmosphere seemed cheerful. Until Charlotte rounded a hedge and unintentionally overheard a conversation. She only receives invitations because of him. Obviously. Without the Duke, no one would know who she is. Charlotte stopped walking. The women had not noticed her. "Do you think he intends to arrange a marriage?" one asked. "Certainly. Men like the Duke enjoy managing lives." More laughter followed. Charlotte turned away before they could see her. The comments should have been easy to dismiss. They were not. Because somewhere beneath the cruelty rested a fear she had never voiced aloud. What if people only saw her through Theodore? What if every invitation, every conversation, every opportunity existed because of him rather than her own worth? The thought followed her home. That evening she sat alone in the library at Blackthorn House staring into the fire. A book rested open on her lap. She had not read a single page. The door opened quietly. Theodore entered. Charlotte did not look up immediately. "You missed dinner." His voice remained calm. Familiar. Steady. Usually comforting. "I was not hungry." Theodore crossed toward the fireplace. Something happened. It was not a question. Charlotte almost smiled despite herself. "You always know." "Charlotte." She sighed. "Nothing important." Theodore waited. Silence stretched between them. Eventually Charlotte surrendered. People talk. People always talk. They seem particularly enthusiastic lately. Theodore's expression darkened slightly. "About what?" Charlotte hesitated. Saying the words aloud somehow made them feel childish. Yet they remained true. "About me." Theodore remained silent. She continued. "About Yorkshire. About being your ward. About whether I belong here." The room grew very still. Theodore's gaze never left her face. "And what do you believe?" Charlotte laughed softly without humor. "I am beginning to wonder." Theodore crossed the remaining distance and stopped beside her chair. "Look at me." She did. His expression carried none of the distant reserve she sometimes saw. None of the cool restraint society expected from him. "You belong wherever you choose to stand." Charlotte blinked. Theodore continued. "You do not need anyone's permission. Not mine. Not society's. Not anyone's." Something tightened painfully in her throat. No elaborate speech could have affected her more. Because Theodore never wasted words. Every sentence carried meaning. "Thank you," she said quietly. His gaze softened. There was never any question. For a moment neither moved. Then footsteps sounded in the corridor. The spell broke instantly. Theodore stepped back. The familiar distance returned. Charlotte suddenly hated it. The realization startled her. Theodore appeared equally unsettled. "There is a ball tomorrow evening," he said. "The Cavendish ball." Charlotte groaned. "Another one?" "Yes." "You enjoy watching me suffer." Theodore almost smiled. An unfortunate side effect of guardianship. Charlotte laughed despite herself. Later that night she stood at her bedroom window looking out over Mayfair. Gas lamps glowed below. Carriages moved through the darkness. Somewhere beyond the rooftops London continued its endless conversations. Her thoughts returned repeatedly to Theodore's words. "You belong wherever you choose to stand." Simple words. Yet they lingered. The following evening the Cavendish ball surpassed every expectation of grandeur. Hundreds of guests filled the enormous ballroom. Music drifted through the air. Diamonds sparkled beneath countless chandeliers. Charlotte entered with Mrs. Dawson while Theodore paused to greet acquaintances near the entrance. At first everything proceeded normally. She danced twice, spoke with several ladies, survived 3 conversations about weather. Then came the moment she would remember long afterward. Charlotte stood near a refreshment table when a group of young women approached. She recognized 2 of them immediately. The same women she had overheard previously. One smiled brightly. Miss Whitmore. Charlotte returned the greeting politely. Good evening. The woman tilted her head. We were just discussing how fortunate you are. Charlotte sensed trouble instantly. In what regard? Why, your position, of course. Another woman joined the conversation. Not everyone receives personal attention from a duke. Soft laughter followed. Several nearby guests turned toward the exchange. Charlotte felt heat rise in her cheeks. The implication hung in the air. Not explicit, yet unmistakable. She forced herself to remain calm. His Grace was a close friend of my father. Of course. More laughter. The kind designed to wound while maintaining plausible innocence. Charlotte realized with growing discomfort that people were watching. Waiting. Enjoying the spectacle. For one awful moment she felt exactly as she had years ago standing alone at school while others whispered behind her back. Invisible and exposed at the same time. Then the ballroom shifted. Conversations quieted. Heads turned. Charlotte looked toward the entrance. Theodore Ashcroft had entered the room. He moved through the crowd with effortless authority. People stepped aside without realizing they were doing so. Within moments he reached the group surrounding Charlotte. Silence spread outward. Miss Whitmore. Theodore extended his hand. His voice remained calm. Yet something about it carried unmistakable command. Charlotte stared for a second. Then placed her hand in his. Theodore's gaze moved briefly toward the women who had cornered her. The look lasted only an instant. It was enough. Every smile disappeared. Every trace of amusement vanished. Your Grace, one woman murmured. Theodore inclined his head. Nothing more. Nothing less. Yet the effect proved remarkable. The group scattered within seconds. Charlotte fought the urge to laugh. That was impressive. Theodore looked down at her. What was? You frightened them. I did no such thing. Charlotte smiled. If you say so. Music swelled from the orchestra. Couples moved toward the dance floor. Theodore remained silent for a moment. Then he said something entirely unexpected. Dance with me. Charlotte stared. What? The next waltz. Her heart forgot how to behave. Around them dozens of guests watched openly. Theodore rarely danced. Everyone knew it. Are you serious? She asked. Yes. Charlotte looked at the hand still resting in his. Then at his face. Then back again. Somewhere across the ballroom, Victoria Holloway watched with unmistakable displeasure. Charlotte noticed. So did Theodore. Neither commented. The music began. Theodore offered his arm formally. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. And as Charlotte placed her hand on his sleeve and stepped toward the dance floor beside him, she became aware of something far more dangerous than gossip. For the first time in her life, she was no longer looking at Theodore Ashcroft as the man who had protected her. She was beginning to see him as the man she might someday lose. And that realization frightened her far more than anything society could say. The moment Charlotte stepped onto the dance floor beside Theodore, the atmosphere of the ballroom changed. She felt it immediately. Conversation softened. Curious eyes followed them. Even the musicians seemed to play with greater precision. It was ridiculous. They were merely dancing. Yet nothing involving Theodore Ashcroft was ever viewed as merely anything. Charlotte placed her hand lightly against his shoulder. Theodore's gloved hand settled at her waist with impeccable propriety. The waltz began. For several moments neither spoke. The silence was not uncomfortable. If anything, it felt dangerously easy. Theodore guided her through the crowded ballroom with effortless confidence. Charlotte found herself relaxing despite the attention surrounding them. "You realize everyone is staring," she murmured. "Yes. And this does not concern you." "No." Charlotte glanced up. "That must be convenient." A faint smile appeared. Occasionally. The smile disappeared almost immediately. Yet she had seen it. Lately those rare moments affected her far more than they should. The realization made her heart beat harder than the dance warranted. Theodore's gaze remained focused beyond her shoulder. Calm. Controlled. Reserved. To anyone watching, he appeared completely unaffected. Charlotte was beginning to suspect appearances could be deceiving. The dance ended too quickly. Theodore escorted her from the floor. Several gentlemen immediately approached. Charlotte found herself surrounded by introductions and invitations. Theodore inclined his head politely and withdrew. The absence of his presence felt unexpectedly noticeable. She disliked that fact. The following days brought a steady stream of social obligations. More balls. More dinners. More opportunities to encounter the same familiar faces. Charlotte gradually adapted to the rhythm of London society. She learned which conversations mattered and which existed purely to fill silence. She learned which smiles were genuine and which concealed hidden motives. Most importantly, she learned that attention attracted more attention. Her dance with Theodore became a topic of discussion across drawing rooms and dinner tables. Charlotte overheard references everywhere. Some harmless. Some less so. "The Duke never dances." "Apparently he does now." "Perhaps Miss Whitmore is more influential than we realized." Or perhaps His Grace is simply protective. The last comment appeared most often. Protective. The word followed her through every gathering. It should have comforted her. Instead it left her unsettled. Because lately she wanted something she had no right to want. She wanted Theodore to look at her the way other men did. Not as a responsibility. Not as a promise. Not as someone who required protection. The thought embarrassed her every time it appeared. Yet it continued appearing regardless. One afternoon, several days after the Cavendish ball, Charlotte accompanied Mrs. Dawson to a charity luncheon hosted by Lady Pembroke. The event occupied a grand townhouse overlooking Hyde Park. Guests gathered beneath crystal chandeliers while servants circulated with tea and delicate pastries. The atmosphere remained pleasant until Charlotte found herself seated beside Lady Margaret Ellsworth. Lady Margaret possessed excellent manners and an unfortunate enthusiasm for discussing marriage. "My dear," she said warmly, "you have become quite popular." Charlotte smiled politely. That is one way to describe it. Several young gentlemen appear interested. Charlotte reached for her teacup. "How alarming." Lady Margaret laughed. "You remind me of myself at your age." "Should I be concerned?" "Absolutely." More laughter followed. Then Lady Margaret lowered her voice. "Have you considered Viscount Nathaniel Harrington?" Charlotte nearly choked on her tea. "I beg your pardon." "An excellent match." Charlotte vaguely recognized the name. Nathaniel Harrington belonged to an old family. Wealthy. Respectable. Attractive according to society's standards. "I do not believe I have spoken with him more than twice." "Then that can easily be corrected." Charlotte suspected Lady Margaret viewed matchmaking as a competitive sport. Unfortunately, many members of society shared the same hobby. Over the next week she encountered Viscount Nathaniel repeatedly. At dinners. At musicales. During afternoon calls. The appearances became so frequent that coincidence seemed unlikely. Nathaniel proved pleasant company. He possessed easy charm and a quick smile. He listened attentively. He remembered details. Most women appeared to admire him. Charlotte found him agreeable. Nothing more. Yet society immediately interpreted every conversation as evidence of growing attachment. The rumors spread rapidly. One evening Charlotte entered the drawing room of Blackthorn House to find Theodore reviewing correspondence beside the fireplace. The familiar sight usually relaxed her. Tonight it made her nervous. She hated that. Theodore looked up. "You are late." Lady Ashcombe hosted a musicale. Enjoyable. Charlotte collapsed into a nearby chair. "I listened to 3 sopranos compete for dominance over civilization." Theodore's mouth twitched. "A difficult evening. You have no idea." She accepted a cup of tea from a servant. Silence settled comfortably between them. Then Theodore set aside one of the letters. "I encountered Harrington this morning." Charlotte nearly dropped her teacup. Theodore continued as though discussing weather. "He spoke highly of you." Charlotte stared. "Did he?" "Yes." She waited. Theodore offered nothing further. The silence became unbearable. "And?" Theodore looked up. "And what?" Charlotte wanted to throw a cushion at him. Most people would have an opinion. About what? The situation. Theodore regarded her calmly. "Harrington is intelligent. Financially secure. Well respected." Every word felt strangely unpleasant. Charlotte did not understand why. That sounds suspiciously like approval. Theodore returned his attention to the correspondence. "It is an observation." Something inside her sank. Hard. Fast. Painfully. She stared at him for several seconds. He remained composed. Unbothered. Rational. Exactly as always. Suddenly Charlotte wished he would stop being reasonable. "I see," she said quietly. Theodore looked up again. Perhaps he heard something unusual in her voice. If so, he gave no indication. The conversation ended shortly afterward. Charlotte excused herself and retreated upstairs. She told herself the disappointment was ridiculous. Completely irrational. Theodore was her guardian. Naturally he wanted her future secured. Naturally he would approve of a suitable match. The logic made perfect sense. It also hurt far more than logic should. Several days later, Theodore attended a private luncheon at White's Club. The elegant gentleman's establishment provided privacy rarely available elsewhere in London. Theodore sat across from Nathaniel Harrington near a window overlooking St. James's Street. Their conversation remained cordial. On the surface. "You admire Miss Whitmore," Theodore said. Nathaniel did not appear surprised. "I do." Theodore studied him carefully. Nathaniel met the scrutiny without hesitation. "She is intelligent," Nathaniel continued. "Kind. Independent. Refreshingly honest." Theodore remained silent. Nathaniel smiled faintly. "You already know all of that." "Yes." Theodore knew. Better than anyone. The realization brought unexpected irritation. "What are your intentions?" Theodore asked. Nathaniel's expression grew serious. "Honorable ones." The answer should have reassured him. Instead it accomplished the opposite. The remainder of the meeting passed politely. Yet Theodore left with a growing sense of unease he could neither justify nor ignore. By every rational measure, Nathaniel Harrington represented an excellent choice. Exactly the sort of husband Charlotte deserved. Exactly the sort of future Theodore should encourage. So why did the prospect leave him feeling as though something important was slipping beyond his reach? The question followed him home. That evening he stood alone in his study staring into the fire. Barnes entered carrying several letters. Theodore barely noticed. "Your Grace." Theodore accepted the correspondence automatically. Barnes hesitated. "Something troubles you." Theodore glanced up. "Does it?" "You have reviewed the same page for 5 minutes." Theodore looked down. Barnes was correct. The document remained unread. The butler waited respectfully. Finally Theodore spoke. "Harrington may propose." Barnes showed remarkable restraint. I see. Theodore returned the papers to his desk. He would be suitable. Yes, Your Grace. Reliable. Indeed. Silence stretched between them. Barnes wisely said nothing further. After a moment Theodore dismissed him. Alone once more, he crossed toward the window. Rain drifted across the city beyond the glass. Lamps glowed along wet streets. Somewhere inside the house Charlotte laughed at something Mrs. Dawson had said. The sound reached him faintly through the corridor. Theodore closed his eyes briefly. Then opened them again. The promise had always been simple. Protect Charlotte. Ensure her happiness. Help her build a secure future. Nothing more. Yet lately the future he had worked so carefully to create felt increasingly unbearable. Across the house, Charlotte sat beside her bedroom fireplace attempting to read. The effort failed completely. Her thoughts returned repeatedly to Theodore's approval of Nathaniel Harrington. Every time she remembered it, disappointment tightened around her heart. Mrs. Dawson observed her quietly for several minutes. Finally she lowered her embroidery hoop. You dislike him? Charlotte blinked. Who? The Viscount. Charlotte considered the question. No. Mrs. Dawson smiled knowingly. Then what troubles you? Charlotte stared into the flames. The answer sat painfully close to the surface. Much too close. Nothing, she said at last. Mrs. Dawson did not believe her. Neither did Charlotte. Later, long after the house had fallen asleep, another carriage moved quietly through London's darkened streets. Inside sat Victoria Holloway. Across from her lounged a gentleman with an easy smile and calculating eyes. Nathaniel Harrington. Victoria lifted a glass of champagne. Everything proceeds exactly as expected. Nathaniel returned the smile. Almost. Victoria's gaze drifted toward the carriage window. Do not worry. Soon enough, everyone will make the choice we want them to make. Neither realized how complicated that choice was about to become. And neither understood that the greatest obstacle standing in their path was not society, reputation, or circumstance. It was Theodore Ashcroft himself. The proposal arrived on a grey Tuesday afternoon wrapped in every appearance of respectability. By evening, half of London seemed aware of it. Charlotte sat in the morning room of Blackthorn House staring at the elegant cream-coloured note resting in her lap. She had read it 3 times already. The words remained unchanged. Nathaniel Harrington had formally requested permission to court her with the intention of marriage. Mrs. Dawson lowered her teacup carefully. You have been staring at that letter for nearly 20 minutes. Charlotte looked up. Has it truly been that long? Longer. Charlotte exhaled slowly. Everyone appears very pleased. Are you? The question settled heavily between them. Charlotte looked back at the letter. Nathaniel was kind. Intelligent. Well regarded. Society approved. Theodore approved. Every practical consideration pointed toward the same conclusion. Yet something inside her remained stubbornly unsettled. I do not know, she admitted. Mrs. Dawson studied her face. Then perhaps that is your answer. Charlotte frowned. What does that mean? Nothing, my dear. The older woman returned to her tea. Only that certainty should not feel like confusion. Before Charlotte could respond, a servant entered carrying another note. From His Grace, Miss. Charlotte accepted it immediately. Theodore's handwriting remained as familiar as her own. A meeting occupies the afternoon. We shall speak this evening. The message contained only one sentence. It somehow made her heart beat faster anyway. The realization annoyed her. Several hours later Theodore returned home. Rain clung to his coat. The city seemed determined to remain damp throughout the entire season. Charlotte found him in the library. The room glowed with firelight. Shelves of books surrounded them. It had become one of her favorite places in London. Theodore looked up as she entered. Something in his expression suggested he already knew why she had come. You received Harrington's letter. Charlotte nodded. Apparently all of London has received Harrington's letter. Theodore almost smiled. An unfortunate tendency. Silence followed. Charlotte waited. Theodore did not immediately speak. The pause felt endless. Finally he set aside the document in his hand. The decision is yours. Charlotte stared. That is all. Theodore met her gaze steadily. What else would you like me to say? Everything, she wanted to answer. Anything. Something that sounded personal rather than practical. Instead she remained silent. Theodore continued. You owe no one an answer before you are ready. The words were kind. Thoughtful. Reasonable. Charlotte hated them. Because they sounded exactly like something a responsible guardian would say. Not like something a man might say if he cared. The realization struck with embarrassing force. She looked away quickly. You think he would make a good husband? Theodore hesitated. Only briefly. Yet she noticed. Yes. The answer landed harder than she expected. Charlotte forced a smile. Then perhaps everyone should be satisfied. Theodore's expression changed slightly. Charlotte. I am tired. She stood abruptly. Good night. Before Theodore could answer, she left the room. Upstairs she closed her bedroom door and leaned against it. Her pulse raced. Her chest felt painfully tight. For the first time she admitted something she had spent months avoiding. She did not want Theodore's approval. She wanted something far more dangerous. She wanted his objection. The following weeks moved quickly. Nathaniel's courtship became official. Flowers arrived regularly. Invitations followed. Public appearances increased. Society responded exactly as expected. Newspapers mentioned the match. Hostesses celebrated it. Mothers approved. Everyone appeared delighted. Everyone except Charlotte. She smiled when required. She attended events. She fulfilled expectations. Yet beneath the surface, unease continued growing. The worst part was Theodore. He remained consistently supportive. Consistently calm. Consistently distant. Every approving remark felt like another step carrying her farther away from him. One evening Charlotte attended a musicale hosted by Lady Fairchild. The gathering occupied a magnificent townhouse overlooking Berkeley Square. Candles illuminated crystal chandeliers. Music drifted through crowded drawing rooms. Guests mingled elegantly. Charlotte stood near a grand piano speaking with Nathaniel when she noticed Victoria Holloway approaching. Victoria wore emerald silk that attracted attention from every corner of the room. Her smile appeared flawless. Charlotte no longer trusted flawless smiles. Miss Whitmore. Victoria greeted her warmly. Lord Harrington. Nathaniel bowed politely. Victoria's gaze lingered on Charlotte. Congratulations seemed to be in order. Charlotte managed a polite response. Nothing has been formally announced. Not yet. Victoria's smile widened slightly. Though everyone expects it. Nathaniel excused himself moments later to greet another guest. Victoria watched him leave. Then she turned back toward Charlotte. The pleasant expression remained. The warmth vanished. You are fortunate. Charlotte had heard those words before. They never improved with repetition. In what regard? Victoria lifted a champagne glass. Most women spend years hoping for a respectable proposal. Charlotte recognized the trap immediately. Nathaniel is a good man. Of course he is. Victoria paused. Although I suppose one cannot always marry the person one truly wants. Charlotte's stomach tightened. I am not sure what you mean. Victoria smiled. No. The question hung between them. Charlotte suddenly wished to be anywhere else. Victoria lowered her voice. People talk. Charlotte. There was no kindness in the use of her first name. People always talk. Charlotte remained silent. Victoria continued. They noticed things. Such as? Victoria tilted her head. The way you look at Theodore. The words hit like cold water. Charlotte felt her face pale. Victoria's smile sharpened. She had found her target. Do not worry, she said softly. Most of society finds it amusing rather than scandalous. Charlotte stared at her. For a moment she could not breathe. You are mistaken. Am I? Victoria took a sip of champagne. Perhaps. She leaned closer. Then again, perhaps everyone sees what you are trying so desperately to hide. Charlotte turned away before Victoria could see the hurt on her face. She crossed the room quickly. Her pulse thundered. The music seemed suddenly distant. The laughter around her sounded artificial. She needed air. She needed space. Most of all, she needed to stop hearing Victoria's words. Unfortunately, the evening only grew worse. By the following week, rumors had begun circulating. Small at first, then larger. Whispers followed Charlotte through drawing rooms and ballrooms alike. Some suggested she hesitated because she secretly loved another man. Others hinted at deeper improprieties. Nothing explicit. Nothing direct. Just enough to damage reputations while preserving deniability. London excelled at such things. Charlotte endured it as long as possible. Then came the engagement dinner. Lady Ashcombe hosted the event in honor of Nathaniel and Charlotte's expected announcement. More than 100 guests attended. Crystal chandeliers blazed overhead. Servants moved through crowded rooms carrying silver trays. Society arrived eager for celebration. Charlotte arrived with a growing sense of dread. Something felt wrong. She could not explain why. Theodore accompanied her. Throughout the carriage ride he remained unusually quiet. Charlotte noticed. She noticed everything about him. Even now. The realization only deepened her misery. You do not have to do this. Theodore's voice interrupted her thoughts. Charlotte looked up. Do what? Attend if you are uncomfortable. The concern in his tone nearly broke her resolve. Everyone expects me to be there. Theodore studied her face. Charlotte. She forced a smile. I am fine. He did not appear convinced. Unfortunately, they had already arrived. The evening began pleasantly enough. Guests mingled. Music played softly. Conversations flowed. Then, just after dinner, disaster arrived wearing a charming smile. Nathaniel requested everyone's attention. The room gradually fell silent. Charlotte's pulse quickened. She assumed an announcement was coming. So did everyone else. Nathaniel raised a champagne glass. Thank you all for joining us this evening. Polite applause followed. Charlotte stood beside him beneath dozens of expectant gazes. Then she noticed something strange. Nathaniel looked nervous. Not happy. Nervous. A chill moved through her. There is something I must say. The room grew quieter. Charlotte suddenly wished she could disappear. Nathaniel cleared his throat. Recent events have led me to reconsider certain plans. Confusion rippled through the crowd. Charlotte felt the floor shift beneath her feet. Nathaniel continued. Therefore, I believe it is best that our courtship end here. Silence. Complete silence. For one terrible second nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Charlotte stared at him. Surely she had misunderstood. Surely this could not be happening. Yet Nathaniel's expression remained fixed. Determined. Final. Around the room whispers erupted like sparks catching dry wood. Charlotte heard fragments. Shock. Surprise. Speculation. Pity. Every eye turned toward her. Every single one. The humiliation hit with brutal force. Not because she loved Nathaniel. She did not. Because rejection in London was never private. It was theatre. Public. Spectacular. Merciless. Charlotte stood perfectly still. Years of training saved her. Years spent learning how to smile through discomfort. How to remain composed beneath scrutiny. She lifted her chin. Forced herself to breathe. Forced herself not to break. Then another voice cut through the room. Deep. Controlled. Dangerous. Enough. Theodore. The entire ballroom went silent again. Charlotte turned toward him. Something in his expression stole the breath from her lungs. She had never seen him look like this. Cold. Furious. Unyielding. Not loud. Somehow that made it worse. Theodore crossed the room. Guests stepped aside instinctively. No one blocked his path. No one dared. He stopped beside Charlotte. Not behind her. Not nearby. Beside her. The position carried unmistakable meaning. His gaze settled on Nathaniel. Explain. Nathaniel swallowed visibly. Around them, society watched in stunned silence. Charlotte's humiliation should have ended the evening. Instead, for the first time, she sensed something far more powerful unfolding. And as Theodore Ashcroft stood beside her with the controlled fury of a man who had finally reached the limit of his patience, every person in the room realized the same thing. Whatever happened next would change everything. The silence that followed Theodore's demand felt heavier than any noise Charlotte had ever heard. More than 100 guests remained frozen in place beneath glittering chandeliers. Crystal glasses reflected candlelight. Musicians sat motionless near the gallery. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Nathaniel Harrington stood at the center of the room looking considerably less confident than he had moments earlier. Theodore remained beside Charlotte. The position was deliberate. Protective. Unmistakable. Charlotte could feel every eye in the ballroom fixed upon them. She should have been humiliated. Instead, she found herself focused entirely on Theodore. She had never seen him like this. Not angry in the obvious sense. Not loud. Not dramatic. His control made the moment far more intimidating. Well? Theodore asked. The single word cut through the silence. Nathaniel swallowed. I do not wish to cause unnecessary discomfort. Several guests exchanged glances. The explanation sounded weak even to Charlotte. Theodore's expression did not change. You invited half of London to witness this. Nathaniel opened his mouth. Closed it again. Around the ballroom, whispers began spreading. Charlotte recognized the shift immediately. Society loved power. It loved scandal even more. Nathaniel had expected to control the narrative. Instead, he appeared trapped within it. Theodore took one measured step forward. If you possess a legitimate concern regarding Miss Whitmore's character, reputation, or conduct, state it clearly. The challenge hung in the air. Nathaniel hesitated. Charlotte already knew why. Because no such concern existed. She had done nothing wrong. Theodore knew it. Nathaniel knew it. Everyone in the room knew it. The Viscount finally lowered his gaze. No. Theodore nodded once. Then we are finished. The simplicity of the dismissal stunned the room. Nathaniel stood speechless. Theodore turned toward Charlotte. His voice softened immediately. Would you like to leave? Charlotte blinked. For several seconds she could not answer. Theodore's anger had vanished as quickly as it appeared. All that remained was concern. Genuine concern. Yes, she said quietly. Theodore offered his arm. Charlotte accepted. Together they crossed the ballroom. Nobody attempted to stop them. Nobody dared. The crowd parted automatically. Charlotte kept her head high. Years of practice carried her through the humiliation. Yet beneath the composure, pain lingered. As they reached the entrance, she glanced back once. Nathaniel remained surrounded by uneasy guests. Victoria Holloway stood nearby. Their eyes met briefly. Something about Victoria's expression felt wrong. Not surprised. Not embarrassed. Almost satisfied. The realization lodged itself in Charlotte's mind. Then Theodore guided her through the doors and into the night. The carriage ride home passed mostly in silence. Rain tapped softly against the windows. London glowed beneath gaslight and mist. Charlotte stared at the blurred streets beyond the glass. Theodore sat across from her. Usually his presence calmed her. Tonight it threatened the fragile control she maintained. "You do not have to pretend with me." The quiet statement startled her. Charlotte looked up. Theodore's gaze remained steady. "I am not pretending." "Charlotte." The gentle warning nearly broke her heart. She laughed softly. The sound lacked humor. "I suppose I should be grateful." Theodore frowned. For what? At least he ended it before making promises he did not intend to keep. The word sounded stronger than she felt. Theodore remained silent for a moment. Then he said something unexpected. "You deserve better." Charlotte looked away immediately. Because hearing those words from him hurt more than hearing them from anyone else. Blackthorn House greeted them with quiet concern. Servants pretended not to notice Charlotte's expression. Mrs. Dawson abandoned all pretense entirely. The moment Charlotte entered the drawing room, the older woman crossed the room and embraced her. Charlotte had not realized how desperately she needed that until it happened. "I am fine," she whispered. Mrs. Dawson squeezed her hand. "Of course you are." The response contained enough disbelief to make Charlotte smile despite herself. Theodore remained nearby for several minutes. Long enough to ensure she was settled. Long enough to confirm she would not be alone. Then he excused himself and disappeared toward his study. Charlotte watched him leave. Something about his departure felt wrong. Later that night she learned why. Theodore Ashcroft rarely involved himself directly in social conflicts. His influence made such actions unnecessary. Tonight proved an exception. The following morning London awoke to an entirely different conversation. Rumors regarding Charlotte's rejection vanished almost overnight. New information appeared instead. Questions emerged concerning Nathaniel Harrington's recent financial decisions. Several business opportunities quietly disappeared. Invitations were withdrawn. Political introductions evaporated. Nothing dramatic occurred. No public accusations. No visible confrontation. Yet somehow, within 24 hours, Nathaniel's social standing began slipping. By the end of the week the decline had become impossible to ignore. Theodore never publicly commented. He did not need to. Society understood exactly what had happened. So did Nathaniel. Charlotte first noticed the shift during a charity luncheon hosted by the Duchess of Pembroke. Conversation stopped when Nathaniel entered the room. Several gentlemen who had previously courted his friendship suddenly found reasons to stand elsewhere. The change was subtle. Ruthlessly effective. Charlotte watched the scene unfold with growing confusion. "What happened?" she asked Mrs. Dawson. The older woman hid a smile behind her teacup. "I have no idea." Charlotte narrowed her eyes. "You are a terrible liar." Mrs. Dawson appeared delighted by the accusation. Across London, Theodore continued his work as though nothing unusual had occurred. Parliamentary meetings occupied his mornings. Estate matters filled his afternoons. Correspondence consumed his evenings. Outwardly, nothing had changed. Inwardly, everything had. One afternoon Barnes entered Theodore's study carrying a stack of reports. Theodore reviewed them in silence. Finally he set one aside. "Victoria Holloway." Barnes nodded. "We continue investigating." Theodore's expression hardened slightly. "And?" "There are connections between Lady Victoria and Lord Harrington." Theodore was not surprised. Continue. Barnes hesitated. Your Grace. Theodore looked up. What? Miss Whitmore is asking questions. Theodore leaned back in his chair. About the engagement. About you. Silence followed. Barnes wisely offered no further explanation. Theodore understood perfectly. Charlotte had always been intelligent, curious, observant. The more he intervened on her behalf, the harder it became to conceal the truth. Let her ask, he said quietly. Barnes raised an eyebrow. Are you certain? Theodore stared toward the rain-covered window. No. Upstairs, Charlotte occupied herself with reading, embroidery, correspondence, and every other distraction she could find. None of them worked. Her thoughts returned constantly to Theodore. To the ballroom. To the look on his face when Nathaniel humiliated her. No one had ever stood beside her that way. No one. The memory refused to fade. Several days later she wandered into a seldom-used section of Blackthorn House while searching for a misplaced novel. The townhouse contained more rooms than any reasonable family required. Corridors twisted unexpectedly. Staircases appeared without warning. Charlotte enjoyed exploring them. The activity helped her think. Eventually she reached the third floor. Few guests visited this level. Most rooms remained locked. She turned a corner and stopped. At the end of the hallway stood a door she had never noticed before. Nothing remarkable distinguished it. Dark wood. Brass handle. Simple lock. Yet something about it captured her attention immediately. Charlotte approached slowly. The door stood slightly apart from the others. More private. More protected. Curious, she tried the handle. Locked. Not surprising. Still, the discovery lingered in her thoughts. That evening she casually mentioned it during dinner. Theodore's reaction lasted less than a second. Most people would have missed it. Charlotte did not. His hand paused. His gaze sharpened. Then everything returned to normal. Storage, he said. Charlotte watched him carefully. Storage. Old records. You seem very protective of old records. Theodore reached for his wine glass. I am protective of all records. The answer sounded reasonable. Too reasonable. Charlotte changed the subject. Outwardly. Inwardly, curiosity exploded. Something about that room mattered. She felt certain of it. Later that night she stood outside the same door once more. Moonlight filtered through nearby windows. The hallway remained empty. Charlotte studied the lock. Storage, Theodore had said. Perhaps. Yet she remembered the expression on his face. The brief flash of alarm. The unusual tension. She reached toward the handle. Then stopped. The action felt wrong somehow. Invasive. Theodore had never denied her anything important. The thought should have ended her curiosity. Instead it deepened it. Because for the first time, Charlotte found herself wondering whether Theodore had been keeping secrets from her all along. And behind that locked door rested enough answers to change her entire understanding of the last 13 years. Charlotte lasted 3 days before curiosity overcame restraint. 3 days of wondering about the locked room. 3 days of replaying Theodore's reaction at dinner. 3 days of telling herself it was none of her business. By the fourth morning she no longer believed her own arguments. Rain drifted softly against the windows of Blackthorn House. Most of the household remained occupied elsewhere. Theodore had departed early for parliamentary meetings. Mrs. Dawson attended a charitable committee gathering. The timing felt dangerously convenient. Charlotte sat in the library pretending to read. She reached the same page for times without absorbing a single sentence. Finally she closed the book. This is ridiculous, she muttered. 10 minutes later she found herself climbing the third-floor staircase. The corridor remained silent. Pale autumn light filtered through tall windows. Dust motes drifted lazily through the air. Charlotte stopped before the familiar door. Her pulse quickened. She still had no intention of forcing her way inside. She merely wanted another look. That was what she told herself. The explanation lasted approximately 30 seconds. Then she noticed something unexpected. The door was not completely closed. The latch had failed to catch. A narrow gap separated the wood from the frame. Charlotte froze. Surely she should leave. Immediately. Sensibly. Respectfully. Instead, she found herself stepping closer. The opening revealed only darkness beyond. No voices. No movement. Nothing. Her hand rose almost of its own accord. The door opened silently. Charlotte stared. The room beyond was far larger than she expected. Shelves lined every wall. Cabinets occupied several corners. A large desk stood near the windows. Sunlight illuminated rows of leather-bound ledgers and carefully organized boxes. At first glance, the space appeared exactly as Theodore described. Storage. Records. Documents. Nothing remarkable. Then Charlotte noticed the name written on a label. Whitmore. Her breath caught. She stepped inside. The door drifted shut behind her. Silence settled over the room. Charlotte approached the nearest shelf. Several boxes rested there. Each carried dates. Some stretched back more than a decade. Her fingers trembled slightly as she opened one. Inside lay correspondence. Dozens of letters. Reports. Notes. All meticulously organized. Charlotte removed the top document. Her heart nearly stopped. Subject: Miss Charlotte Whitmore. Date: October 1851. Observation: arrived safely at school. Appears settled. No concerns. Charlotte stared at the page. Then at another. Then another. Subject: Miss Charlotte Whitmore. Date: February 1852. Observation: winter illness improving. Physician expects full recovery. Her pulse thundered. She reached for another file. Then another. Every document contained her name. Every document concerned her life. School reports. Travel arrangements. Medical updates. Social observations. Charity activities. Household concerns. Hundreds of pages. Hundreds. Charlotte slowly lowered herself into a nearby chair. Her mind struggled to process what she was seeing. It was impossible. Absurd. Yet the evidence surrounded her. Someone had been tracking every major event in her life for years. Not casually. Not occasionally. Systematically. Carefully. Relentlessly. Her gaze drifted toward a row of leather journals. She selected one at random and opened it. The first entry nearly stole her breath. Miss Whitmore fell from her horse today. No serious injury sustained. Physician summoned immediately. The date matched the accident she remembered from childhood. Charlotte's hands tightened around the journal. She turned another page. Miss Whitmore's school difficulties have been resolved. Appropriate arrangements completed. Another page. Lost necklace recovered discreetly. Another. Carriage wheel failure. No injuries. His Grace arrived before significant delay occurred. Charlotte closed the journal abruptly. Her entire body felt numb. Every coincidence. Every unexpected rescue. Every perfectly timed intervention. They had never been coincidences. Not one. Someone had been watching. Someone had always known. Someone had always been there. Theodore. The realization arrived with overwhelming force. Theodore. Charlotte rose and crossed the room in a daze. More boxes. More files. More evidence. 13 years of evidence. Every shelf seemed to contain another piece of her life. Every cabinet revealed another secret. Then she noticed a smaller desk near the far wall. Unlike the others, this one remained locked. A single key rested in the drawer beneath. Charlotte hesitated only briefly before using it. The lock clicked. The drawer opened. Inside rested bundles of letters tied neatly with ribbon. Charlotte recognized the handwriting immediately. Her own. Every birthday card she had ever sent Theodore. Every childish note. Every letter from school. Every thank you message. He had kept all of them. Every single one. Charlotte sank into the chair once more. Her vision blurred unexpectedly. Why? Why would he keep them? A man like Theodore received correspondence constantly. Important letters. Political letters. Legal letters. Yet somehow he had preserved every careless note she ever wrote. Her gaze moved deeper into the drawer. Beneath the letters rested a small carved wooden horse. The same one she had discovered at Whitmore Hall. For a moment she simply stared. Then she laughed softly through the tears threatening to form. "What have you done?" she whispered. The question echoed through the empty room. Another item caught her attention. A leather-bound journal unlike the others. The cover carried no title. No label. Charlotte opened it carefully. The handwriting belonged to Theodore. She knew it instantly. The first entry dated back 13 years. Richard Whitmore passed away this morning. Charlotte slept through most of the night. She does not yet understand what has happened. The words blurred briefly. Charlotte swallowed hard and continued reading. I promised him she would be protected. Whatever the cost. Her chest tightened painfully. She turned another page. Charlotte cried today when she believed no one could hear. I remained outside the nursery door longer than necessary. Another page. Her first day at school. She pretended bravery. She is too much like her father. Another. She wrote me a letter describing a bird she saw outside her window. 3 pages. Every detail. The journal was not a report. It was something else entirely. Something far more personal. Charlotte read for what felt like hours. The entries revealed a side of Theodore she had never known. Not the Duke. Not the Guardian. Simply a man watching over a frightened child because he made a promise. A man who gradually became invested in every small success and disappointment. A man who remembered everything. Her first riding lesson. Her favorite books. Her fear of thunderstorms. Her habit of pretending she was not hurt when she was. Charlotte reached the final entries. The handwriting appeared more recent. More difficult. More restrained. London season approaches. She is no longer a child. The word sent a strange ache through her. She turned the page. Charlotte looked at me differently today. I should have imagined it. Another page. She laughed during dinner. I spent the remainder of the evening pretending the sound did not affect me. Charlotte's breath caught. She stared at the sentence. Then at the next. Distance is necessary. Unfortunately, distance becomes more difficult each day. Her pulse pounded loudly in her ears. She turned another page. Harrington intends to propose. He is suitable. He is everything I should want for her future. The final line appeared several inches below the rest. I have never hated a suitable man more. Charlotte closed the journal instantly. Her hands trembled. The room seemed too small. Too quiet. Too full of truth she had never expected to find. Everything changed in that moment. Not because she learned Theodore protected her. Some part of her had already suspected that. Everything changed because she finally understood why. The realization settled over her slowly. Carefully. Like dawn breaking after a very long night. Theodore had not protected her out of obligation alone. He had not spent 13 years preserving letters, collecting reports, and watching over every detail of her life because of duty. Somewhere along the way, something else had happened. Something neither of them had dared name. Charlotte pressed a hand against her chest. Her heart felt too large for her body. Too full. Too overwhelmed. Then her gaze landed on one final object resting at the back of the drawer. A sealed envelope. Old. Yellowed. The wax seal bore her father's crest. Richard Whitmore. Charlotte froze. Slowly, she picked it up. The envelope carried a single inscription written in her father's hand. To be opened only when Charlotte is ready to know the truth. The room went completely still. Charlotte stared at the letter. Her father's letter. The one Theodore had never mentioned. The one hidden for 13 years. And for the first time since entering the room, she realized there were still secrets she did not understand. Secrets far older than London. Far older than Nathaniel Harrington. Secrets connected to her father, Theodore, and a promise made beside a deathbed long ago. Charlotte stared at the envelope for a very long time. The room remained silent around her. Dust drifted through narrow beams of afternoon sunlight. Shelves filled with 13 years of secrets surrounded her on every side. Yet all of it faded into the background. Nothing seemed more important than the yellowed envelope resting in her hands. Her father's handwriting appeared unmistakable. Strong. Familiar. Painfully familiar. To be opened only when Charlotte is ready to know the truth. The words echoed through her mind. She should wait for Theodore. Common sense insisted upon it. Respect demanded it. But another voice, quieter and far older, whispered a different question. If not now, when? Charlotte broke the seal. Her fingers trembled slightly as she unfolded the pages inside. The letter contained several sheets. The ink had faded with age, yet every word remained readable. My dearest Charlotte, if you are reading this, it means time has passed more quickly than I ever wished. It means you are no longer the little girl who followed butterflies through the gardens of Whitmore Hall. It means Theodore has finally decided you are ready. Charlotte stopped reading. Her throat tightened immediately. Even after 13 years, seeing her father's words felt like hearing his voice again. She forced herself to continue. There are truths I hope to tell you myself. Life had other plans. If you have reached this letter, then I must trust Theodore has kept his promise. Of all the men I have known, there is no one I trust more completely. Charlotte swallowed hard. Her gaze moved down the page. I asked Theodore for two things before I died. The first was simple. Protect my daughter. The second was far more difficult. Keep hidden what others would gladly steal. Charlotte's pulse quickened. The letter continued. Your mother came from an old family. Older than most people realized. Before her death she entrusted me with documents concerning property, investments, and legal rights that had been concealed for generations. The holdings were substantial. Large enough to attract dangerous interest from the wrong people. Large enough to place you at risk if revealed too early. Charlotte stared. Her hands tightened around the pages. Memories surfaced immediately. Questions about inheritance. Gregory Whitmore's investigations. The strange report she had found upstairs. Slowly, pieces began fitting together. If anything happens to me, Theodore knows where the documents are secured. He alone possesses the authority necessary to protect them until you come of age. Trust him. Even when you do not understand him. Especially then. Tears blurred Charlotte's vision. She blinked them away and continued reading. I know Theodore. Better than he realizes. He will treat this responsibility as a duty. He will likely convince himself that duty is all it is. He has always been stubborn in matters involving his own heart. Charlotte froze. Her eyes returned to the sentence. Then moved forward slowly. If the years change him as I suspect they will, remember something important. The finest parts of a man's character reveal themselves not through grand declarations, but through quiet acts repeated over time. Pay attention to who remains when no one is watching. Charlotte lowered the letter slightly. The room seemed impossibly still. She already knew who remained. 13 years of evidence surrounded her. Every report. Every intervention. Every carefully hidden sacrifice. Her father had known. Somehow he had known. She returned to the final section. I wish I could tell you what kind of woman you become. Since I cannot, I will leave you with this. Trust your own judgment. Follow kindness whenever possible. And never mistake loyalty for something ordinary. It is among the rarest gifts in the world. I love you. Always. Father. Charlotte closed her eyes. For several moments she simply sat there holding the letter against her chest. Grief and comfort mingled together. Pain and gratitude. Loss and love. Eventually she folded the pages carefully and placed them beside the journal. Then another realization struck her. The inheritance. Theodore had not merely protected her. He had protected something connected to her future. Something valuable enough to attract attention even now. A soft sound in the hallway startled her. Charlotte looked toward the door. Footsteps. Someone approaching. Instinctively she gathered the journal and letter. The footsteps passed. Silence returned. Yet the interruption reminded her of something important. Theodore would return eventually. She should leave before he discovered her here. Instead she remained seated. Questions continued multiplying. She reached for another folder. Then another. Gradually a broader picture emerged. Legal correspondence. Financial records. Property agreements. Documents connected to investments managed over many years. Everything pointed toward one conclusion. Theodore had expanded and protected her inheritance with extraordinary care. The value appeared far greater than she imagined. Far greater than most people knew. Which explained Gregory Whitmore's interest. It explained Nathaniel's sudden involvement. It explained far too much. Hours passed unnoticed. Eventually fading sunlight warned her that evening approached. Charlotte reluctantly returned documents to their proper places. She handled each page carefully. Reverently. The room no longer felt like a collection of secrets. It felt like evidence of devotion. Before leaving, she glanced toward Theodore's journal one final time. One sentence remained fixed in her thoughts. Distance is necessary. Unfortunately, distance becomes more difficult each day. Her heart squeezed painfully. She understood now. Theodore had not been distant because he felt nothing. He had been distant because he felt too much. The realization changed everything. Charlotte quietly exited the room and closed the door behind her. Downstairs, Blackthorn House bustled with normal evening activity. Servants prepared dinner. Lamps were lit throughout the residence. Life continued exactly as before. Except nothing felt the same. Mrs. Dawson found Charlotte in the drawing room an hour later. One look at her face was enough. You know. Charlotte stared. You knew too. The older woman smiled sadly. Not everything. Enough. Mrs. Dawson lowered herself into a nearby chair. Enough. Charlotte laughed softly. Everyone knew except me. Not everyone. Mrs. Dawson's expression softened. Theodore worked very hard to ensure that. Charlotte looked down at her hands. Why? The answer came without hesitation. Because he promised. Charlotte thought about that. Then about 13 years of reports. Hundreds of letters. Countless interventions. It became more than a promise. Mrs. Dawson remained silent. The silence itself was an answer. Later that night, Theodore returned home. Charlotte heard his arrival from the second-floor gallery. Her pulse immediately accelerated. She hated that. She loved it. Both feelings seemed equally true. Below, Theodore handed his coat to a servant and exchanged several quiet words with Barnes. Nothing appeared unusual. Yet Charlotte now saw details she once overlooked. The fatigue hidden behind composure. The constant vigilance. The way his eyes automatically scanned a room. The way his attention always seemed to search for her without appearing to do so. She understood now. Every part of it. Theodore looked up. Their eyes met across the hall. For a brief moment neither moved. Then Charlotte turned away. Not because she wished to avoid him. Because she did not yet trust herself to speak. Theodore watched her disappear down the corridor. A familiar sense of unease settled over him. Something felt different. Very different. He found Barnes waiting in the study. Several documents rested upon the desk. Theodore barely glanced at them. What happened today? Barnes hesitated. Theodore immediately noticed. Barnes. The butler sighed quietly. The third-floor room was opened. Every muscle in Theodore's body went still. Silence filled the study. Barnes continued carefully. The door was not properly secured. Theodore closed his eyes briefly. Just once. Then opened them again. How much? I do not know. Theodore stared toward the darkened window. The answer did not matter. He already knew. Charlotte had discovered everything. Or nearly everything. A strange mixture of dread and relief settled inside him. The secret had always been unsustainable. Sooner or later the truth would emerge. The question was never whether it would happen. Only when. A second knock interrupted the silence. Arthur Hale entered carrying an envelope. His expression looked unusually grave. Theodore accepted the message and broke the seal. The contents erased every other concern instantly. What is it? Barnes asked. Theodore read the letter twice. Then a third time. His expression hardened. Gregory Whitmore. Arthur nodded. He has obtained information regarding the inheritance. Theodore set the letter down slowly. How much information? Enough to become dangerous. The room fell silent. Charlotte remained unaware of the conversation unfolding downstairs. Unaware that her father's hidden legacy had finally attracted the attention it was always meant to avoid. Unaware that someone had already begun moving against her. And unaware that Theodore Ashcroft, after 13 years of protecting her from every visible threat, was about to face the most serious challenge of all. By the end of the week, London had discovered a new scandal. Charlotte Whitmore woke to it without warning. She entered the breakfast room expecting tea and quiet conversation. Instead, she found Mrs. Dawson holding a newspaper with an expression that immediately raised concern. What happened? Charlotte asked. Mrs. Dawson folded the paper. Nothing worth your attention. Charlotte narrowed her eyes. That usually means the opposite. The older woman hesitated. That hesitation was answer enough. Charlotte crossed the room and took the newspaper. The article occupied only a few paragraphs near the center page. No names appeared directly. They rarely did. Society preferred implication. The piece described a young woman whose rise through London's social circles allegedly depended upon unusual influence from a powerful aristocrat. Charlotte felt her stomach tighten. She did not need to read further. The target was obvious. How many people have seen this? She asked quietly. Mrs. Dawson sighed. Enough. Charlotte lowered the paper. Wonderful. Charlotte. No. It is fine. She forced a smile. Apparently London required new entertainment. The smile fooled neither of them. By afternoon the rumors had multiplied. Invitations that normally arrived each day suddenly slowed. Conversations changed when she entered rooms. Several acquaintances appeared strangely distant. Nothing dramatic. Nothing obvious. Merely hundreds of tiny shifts that together created a painful pattern. Society had found a fresh story. And Charlotte stood at its center. The worst part was not the gossip itself. The worst part was what people chose to believe. According to the rumors, Charlotte had manipulated Theodore's affection for years. She had used his protection to gain social advantage. Some versions suggested ambition. Others implied far worse. Each retelling grew more imaginative, more cruel, more absurd. Charlotte endured the first few days with determination. She attended scheduled events, smiled when required, maintained her composure. Then came the luncheon at Lady Fairchild's townhouse. The gathering should have been pleasant. Elegant rooms, respectable guests, harmless conversation. Instead, it became a lesson in how quickly society could turn. Charlotte entered the drawing room shortly after noon. Several women greeted her politely. Others did not. She noticed immediately. A month earlier, such behavior would have puzzled her. Now she understood perfectly. The room quieted ever so slightly. Not enough to seem deliberate. Enough to hurt. Charlotte crossed toward an empty chair. Voices drifted from a nearby group. Such a shame. Indeed. Though perhaps not entirely surprising. Soft laughter followed. Charlotte continued walking without acknowledging them. Every instinct urged her to leave. Pride refused. She sat gracefully. Accepted tea. Participated in conversation. Performed exactly as expected. Inside, however, exhaustion settled deeper with every passing minute. Later, while guests wandered through the garden, Charlotte found herself alone near a stone fountain. The autumn air felt cool against her skin. For the first time all day she could breathe. You should not be alone. The familiar voice behind her caused her heart to stumble. Charlotte turned. Theodore approached across the garden path. Dark coat. Steady gaze. Controlled expression. Somehow the sight of him made everything harder. Not easier. Harder. Because now she knew. She knew about the journals. The reports. The letters. The years of silent devotion. And she had no idea how to act as though nothing had changed. Theodore studied her carefully. You look tired. Charlotte attempted a smile. Society continues to be demanding. Society can be ignored. That is easy for a dupe to say. Theodore stopped beside the fountain. What happened today? Charlotte laughed softly. You already know. Silence followed. Theodore's expression darkened. People are speaking foolishly. That is a remarkably diplomatic description. I am attempting restraint. The answer surprised a genuine smile from her. Theodore noticed. Something warm flickered briefly in his eyes. Then the moment passed. Charlotte looked away first. It does not matter. Theodore said nothing. Charlotte knew that silence. It meant he disagreed completely. Across the garden, several guests watched openly. Charlotte noticed. So did Theodore. Neither commented. Eventually Theodore offered his arm. Come. Where? Home. Charlotte should have refused. Instead she accepted immediately. The gesture felt natural. Familiar. Safe. As they crossed the garden together, conversations followed them. Curious eyes tracked every movement. Charlotte no longer cared. By evening the rumors intensified again. Someone had seen Theodore escorting her from the luncheon. Someone else claimed he refused several invitations afterward. By morning entirely new stories circulated. Most were ridiculous. Unfortunately, ridicule rarely prevented belief. 3 days later Charlotte attended a charity concert at the Royal Academy. She almost declined. Mrs. Dawson convinced her otherwise. You cannot hide forever. I was hoping to try. No. Charlotte sighed dramatically. You are very determined. One of us must be. The concert hall filled quickly. Music drifted through the grand chamber. Distinguished guests occupied rows of velvet-covered seats. Charlotte arrived alone. Theodore had parliamentary obligations. She told herself his absence did not matter. Her heart disagreed. The evening proceeded smoothly until intermission. Then Charlotte overheard her own name. Again. She has always depended on him. Of course she has. What happens when the Duke finally tires of the arrangement? More laughter. Charlotte closed her eyes briefly. She no longer felt anger. Only weariness. Deep, relentless weariness. Before she could retreat, another voice interrupted. An interesting question. Silence followed. Charlotte recognized the voice instantly. Theodore. The women turned pale. Theodore stood behind them with the calm authority of a man entirely aware of his influence. Your Grace, one whispered. Theodore inclined his head politely. You seem concerned about Miss Whitmore's future. Neither woman answered. Theodore's expression remained perfectly composed. Allow me to ease your concerns. The room had grown very quiet. Nearby conversation slowed. Attention shifted toward the exchange. Theodore continued. Miss Whitmore possesses more intelligence, integrity, and strength than most people achieve in a lifetime. No one moved. No one breathed. Charlotte felt rooted to the floor. Theodore's gaze swept calmly across the room. Anyone unable to recognize that speaks only to their own limitations. Silence followed. Complete silence. Then Theodore turned toward Charlotte. The conversation ended as efficiently as it began. Yet the effect lingered. Every person present had heard. Every person present understood. Charlotte could not speak during the carriage ride home. She could barely think. Theodore's words echoed endlessly through her mind. More intelligence, integrity, and strength than most people achieve in a lifetime. No one had ever defended her that way. No one. The following morning brought unexpected consequences. Society divided. Some continued spreading rumors. Others openly questioned them. Several influential families resumed their support. Invitations returned. Conversations shifted. The tide had not completely turned. But it was changing. Theodore's public defense carried weight. Enormous weight. Unfortunately, it also attracted new attention. That afternoon Arthur Hale arrived at Blackthorn House carrying troubling news. Theodore met him in the study. Tell me. Arthur removed several documents from his case. Gregory Whitmore has become increasingly active. Theodore's expression hardened. Explain. He has been meeting with solicitors. Arthur placed the papers on the desk. And with Lady Victoria Holloway. Theodore's eyes narrowed. The connection confirmed several suspicions at once. Arthur continued. We believe they have discovered part of the inheritance structure. Silence filled the room. Theodore studied the documents carefully. Part. Not all. Arthur hesitated. Yet. Theodore moved toward the window. Rain streaked across the glass. London appeared grey beneath heavy clouds. For years he had protected Charlotte from visible dangers. This threat felt different. More deliberate. More coordinated. More personal. Arthur watched him quietly. There is another problem. Theodore turned. What? Arthur exhaled slowly. Lady Victoria intends to make a public accusation. The room went still. Theodore's expression became unreadable. Arthur continued. We do not know the exact details. Only that she believes she possesses enough information to damage Miss Whitmore's reputation permanently. For several seconds neither spoke. Then Theodore asked a single question. When? Arthur handed him an invitation. Theodore recognized it immediately. Blackthorn House Annual Winter Ball. His own event. The largest social gathering of the season. Arthur's voice remained low. She plans to do it there. Theodore stared at the invitation. Hundreds of guests would attend. Politicians. Aristocrats. Influential families from across England. The perfect stage for public humiliation. Arthur waited. Finally, Theodore set the invitation down. His expression remained calm. Too calm. The kind of calm that appeared only when a decision had already been made. Upstairs, Charlotte sat near her bedroom window, unaware of the conversation unfolding below. She watched rain fall across Mayfair and wondered how life had become so complicated. She wondered whether Theodore knew she had found the journals. She wondered how long she could continue pretending otherwise. Most of all, she wondered what would happen if the truth finally came into the open. Downstairs, Theodore looked once more at the invitation resting on his desk. Then at the reports concerning Gregory Whitmore. Then at the evidence connecting Victoria Holloway to the growing scandal. For the first time in many years, he stopped thinking about how to hide the truth. Instead, he began considering what would happen if the truth was revealed to all of London at once. The night of the Blackthorn Winter Ball arrived beneath a sky crowded with stars and winter clouds. From the moment the first carriage rolled into Grosvenor Square, London understood the significance of the event. Blackthorn House blazed with light. Hundreds of candles illuminated every window. Crystal chandeliers transformed the grand ballroom into a sea of gold and silver. Aristocrats from across England arrived one after another. Dukes, earls, members of Parliament, influential families whose opinions shaped society itself. By 8 o'clock, the house overflowed with guests. Charlotte stood before the mirror in her room and wondered why her hands would not stop trembling. Mrs. Dawson adjusted the final ribbon on her gown. "You look beautiful." Charlotte managed a small smile. "That is kind of you." "It is also true." Charlotte turned toward the older woman. The silver blue silk gown reflected the candlelight softly. Her hair had been arranged with elegant simplicity. Everything appeared perfect. Yet an uneasy feeling remained. The past week had changed something fundamental. Theodore knew. She was almost certain of it. Somehow he knew she had discovered the journals. And somehow she knew he was waiting for her to speak first. Neither of them had. The silence between them had become impossible to ignore. Not uncomfortable. Not distant. Merely full of things left unsaid. A knock sounded at the door. Charlotte's heart immediately betrayed her. "Come in." Theodore entered. For a brief moment neither spoke. He wore formal evening attire. Dark coat. Immaculate tailoring. The familiar image of authority and restraint. Yet something in his expression shifted when he looked at her. Something warm. Something unguarded. The moment lasted only seconds. It was enough. "You are ready," he said quietly. Charlotte smiled. "Apparently." Theodore continued looking at her. The silence stretched longer than expected. Mrs. Dawson glanced between them and suddenly remembered an urgent need to leave the room. "I should check on the flowers downstairs." She disappeared before either could stop her. Charlotte almost laughed. Theodore looked faintly amused. Then the amusement faded. "Charlotte." The way he said her name made her pulse quicken. "Yes?" For one suspended moment she thought he might finally say it. Everything. The truth. The journals. The years between them. Instead he offered his arm. "Shall we?" Charlotte placed her hand on his sleeve. "Yes." Together they descended the grand staircase. The ballroom below sparkled with conversation and music. Guests turned as they entered. Charlotte noticed immediately. Not because of curiosity. Something else had changed. The whispers had diminished. The judgment had weakened. Theodore's public defense had altered the social landscape. Not entirely. Enough. As they entered the ballroom, conversations resumed. Several guests approached. Introductions followed. Greetings. Polite exchanges. Everything appeared perfectly normal. Too normal. Theodore sensed it as well. Charlotte noticed the subtle vigilance in his posture. the careful awareness beneath the calm exterior. He was waiting. An hour passed. Then another. The evening progressed smoothly. Almost suspiciously smoothly. Charlotte began wondering whether Arthur's warning had been incorrect. Then she saw Victoria Holloway. Victoria stood near the center of the ballroom wearing deep crimson silk. Her smile appeared radiant. Triumphant. Dangerous. Charlotte felt cold immediately. Theodore noticed her reaction. His gaze followed hers across the room. The change in his expression was nearly imperceptible. Yet Charlotte saw it. "Stay near me," he said quietly. Charlotte looked up. Theodore. It was the first time she had used only his name. No uncle. No title. Just Theodore. He froze. The smallest reaction imaginable. Yet it was there. Before either could speak further, a voice carried clearly across the ballroom. "Ladies and gentlemen." The room gradually fell silent. Charlotte turned. Victoria stood near the orchestra platform. Every eye shifted toward her. Theodore's jaw tightened. The moment had arrived. Victoria smiled gracefully. "Forgive the interruption. I simply believe certain truths deserve public acknowledgement." Unease spread through the crowd. Charlotte felt her stomach drop. Theodore stepped slightly closer. Not touching her. Protecting her. Victoria continued. "For months London has debated rumours surrounding Miss Charlotte Whitmore." Silence deepened. Charlotte heard her own heartbeat. Most of us have wondered why a powerful duke would devote such extraordinary attention to one young woman. Murmurs spread through the room. Victoria's gaze settled directly on Charlotte. Perhaps the answer is simpler than anyone realized. Charlotte stood perfectly still. Theodore did not move. Victoria smiled. Perhaps Miss Whitmore's influence has always been financial rather than emotional. Confusion rippled through the audience. Victoria lifted several papers. Recently acquired documents suggest Miss Whitmore possesses a hidden inheritance worth far more than society understands. Charlotte's breath caught. Around the ballroom, shocked whispers erupted. Victoria pressed forward. An inheritance concealed for years. Managed by one man. Controlled by one man. Her eye shifted toward Theodore. The Duke of Blackthorn. Silence crashed over the room. Charlotte felt every gaze turning toward them. Victoria believed she had won. Charlotte could see it. The confidence. The certainty. Victoria expected embarrassment. Scandal. Humiliation. Theodore stepped forward. Calmly. Deliberately. "Are you finished?" Victoria blinked. The response clearly surprised her. "I am revealing the truth." Theodore accepted one of the papers from her hand. He glanced at it briefly. Then looked back up. "No. You are revealing fragments." The ballroom remained silent. Theodore's voice carried effortlessly. "Miss Whitmore's inheritance exists. That much is true." More whispers followed. Victoria's smile widened. Then Theodore continued. "It was entrusted to my care by her father 13 years ago." The smile vanished. "Every action I have taken concerning those assets was authorized legally and documented thoroughly." Several solicitors in attendance immediately exchanged glances. Theodore turned toward the crowd. "Many of you knew Richard Whitmore." Heads nodded throughout the room. "You knew his character. His judgment. His devotion to his daughter." Silence returned. Theodore's gaze hardened slightly. "The suggestion that I exploited either his trust or hers is insulting." Victoria's confidence faltered. For the first time, uncertainty appeared. Theodore was not finished. "Since we are discussing truth tonight, perhaps we should discuss all of it." Victoria went pale. Charlotte felt her pulse quicken. Theodore held up another document. One she had never seen before. including correspondence connecting Lady Victoria Holloway to Lord Nathaniel Harrington prior to the dissolution of his courtship. Shock spread through the ballroom. Victoria's face drained of colour. Theodore continued. And financial arrangements intended to benefit several interested parties should Miss Whitmore's reputation suffer sufficient damage. Complete silence followed. The kind of silence that changes lives. Victoria stared at him. You cannot prove that. Theodore handed the documents to one of London's most respected solicitors standing nearby. The elderly gentleman adjusted his spectacles and began reading. His expression darkened immediately. Around the room, society reached the same conclusion. Victoria had not exposed Charlotte. She had exposed herself. The reversal happened visibly. Guests who moments earlier listened with curiosity now looked at Victoria with disapproval. Some stepped away entirely. Others whispered behind raised fans. Charlotte watched in astonishment. Years of social experience taught her exactly what she was witnessing. Public judgment had changed direction. Victoria realized it too. Her composure fractured. Not dramatically. Just enough. Theodore turned away from her entirely. The gesture proved devastating. She no longer mattered. The crowd understood. The conversation was over. Yet Theodore was still not finished. He crossed the ballroom toward Charlotte. Every guest watched. Every guest listened. Charlotte's heart pounded. Theodore stopped before her. For one suspended moment the entire world seemed to disappear. No orchestra. No guests. No scandal. Only Theodore. His gaze met hers. Steady. Certain. Honest. For 13 years, he said quietly, though the entire room could hear, I have protected what Richard Whitmore entrusted to me. Charlotte felt tears threaten. Theodore continued. His daughter. Her future. Her happiness. The ballroom remained silent. Nobody dared interrupt. Theodore drew a slow breath. Then, for the first time in his life, he stopped hiding. Somewhere along the way, those responsibilities became something far more personal. Charlotte's breath caught. Around them, society seemed to vanish completely. Theodore reached into his coat pocket. The movement sent a wave of shock through the room. Then he lowered himself onto one knee. Gasps erupted everywhere. Charlotte could not move. Could not think. Could barely breathe. Theodore looked up at her. Charlotte Whitmore. His voice was steady. Yet she heard the emotion beneath it. Years of restraint. Years of silence. Years of devotion. I spent a long time convincing myself that protecting you was enough. Tears blurred her vision. Theodore smiled softly. I was wrong. The ballroom stood frozen. I love you. The word settled over the room like sunlight after a storm. Simple. Honest. Undeniable. Theodore held her gaze. If you are willing, I would like to spend the rest of my life proving it. Charlotte felt tears spill freely now. Not from sadness. From relief. From joy. From finally hearing the truth she had already discovered hidden inside journals and letters. The truth that had been waiting for years. She laughed softly through her tears. Theodore. His expression softened further. Yes? Charlotte smiled. You are very late. Laughter rippled through the ballroom. Theodore actually laughed. Openly. Freely. For perhaps the first time in years. Charlotte held out her hand. Yes. The single word changed everything. Cheers erupted throughout the ballroom. Applause followed. Smiles spread from guest to guest. Mrs. Dawson openly cried near the staircase. Even several stern aristocrats appeared suspiciously emotional. Theodore rose and took Charlotte's hand. The warmth of his fingers felt wonderfully familiar. Yet entirely new. Around them, London witnessed the end of one story and the beginning of another. And somewhere within the crowd, unnoticed by nearly everyone, Gregory Whitmore watched the scene unfold with growing alarm. Because while society celebrated the engagement, he realized something far more dangerous. The final secret of the Whitmore inheritance had not yet been revealed. The morning after the proposal, London awakened to a different world. Newspapers celebrated the engagement. Drawing rooms buzzed with excitement. Invitations arrived faster than servants could sort them. Families who once whispered now offered congratulations. The same society that had questioned Charlotte Whitmore's place now spoke admiringly of her grace, resilience, and good fortune. The reversal would have felt absurd if it had not been so satisfying. Charlotte stood in the breakfast room of Blackthorn House holding a stack of letters while sunlight streamed through the windows. Apparently half of England wishes us happiness. Theodore glanced up from his newspaper. Only half. Charlotte smiled. The other half appears disappointed they did not hear the news first. Theodore folded the paper and studied her for a moment. There was still something wonderfully unfamiliar about that look. Not hidden. Not restrained. Open. Warm. Entirely hers. You are smiling again, he observed. I have reasons. Good. The simple exchange filled the room with quiet contentment. Mrs. Dawson watched from the far end of the table and looked suspiciously pleased with herself. Charlotte suspected the older woman considered the engagement a personal victory. She was probably correct. Yet beneath the happiness, one unresolved issue remained. Gregory Whitmore. 3 days later that issue arrived directly at Blackthorn House. Theodore met Charlotte in the library shortly after noon. His expression was calm. Too calm. Charlotte immediately recognized it. What happened? Theodore closed the door behind him. Gregory has formally challenged several inheritance protections. Charlotte set aside her book. Can he do that? He can try. Theodore crossed toward the fireplace. The challenge will fail. Charlotte trusted him completely. Even so, concern lingered. Then why do you look troubled? Theodore was silent for a moment. Then he smiled faintly. You know me too well. Charlotte laughed softly. I had 13 years of assistance. Something flickered across his face. A mixture of embarrassment and affection. Neither of them mentioned the journals. Not directly. They no longer needed to. Theodore lowered himself into a nearby chair. There is one final matter your father wanted revealed only when the proper time arrived. Charlotte's pulse quickened. The inheritance. Theodore nodded. Partly. He removed a small leather portfolio from a cabinet. Charlotte immediately recognized the seal. Her father's. Theodore placed it carefully on the table between them. Your father created a trust structure before his death. Charlotte listened closely. Most of the assets belonged to your mother's family. However, one portion was never about wealth. Theodore opened the portfolio. Inside rested several property deeds, maps, and letters. Charlotte frowned. Yorkshire? Theodore nodded. Thousands of acres. Her confusion deepened. I thought Whitmore Hall already belonged to our family. It does. Theodore slid another document forward. These do not. Charlotte read the papers slowly. Then read them again. Her eyes widened. Schools. Tenant housing. Agricultural projects. Charitable endowments. Entire communities. Her father had quietly established long-term funds supporting hundreds of families throughout Yorkshire. The holdings generated revenue. Yet their primary purpose was service. Charlotte looked up. He never told anyone. Theodore's voice softened. That was intentional. Tears stung unexpectedly. Why? Theodore handed her another letter. This one shorter than the first. Charlotte unfolded it carefully. My darling girl, if you are reading this, then the time has come to understand what matters most. Wealth itself means little. What we do with it matters greatly. If Theodore believes you are ready, these responsibilities now belong to you. Help where you can. Build when others destroy. Remember that privilege means nothing unless it improves the lives of others. Charlotte pressed the letter against her chest. Her father seemed astonishingly present in moments like these. Theodore watched quietly. Eventually Charlotte looked up. You protected all of this too. Theodore smiled. I promised. Charlotte shook her head. You always say that. Because it is true. No. Her voice softened. It stopped being only a promise a very long time ago. Theodore looked away briefly. The rare gesture revealed more emotion than any speech could have. Several weeks later, legal challenges collapsed one after another. Gregory Whitmore discovered that Theodore had anticipated every possible attack years in advance. Documentation existed for everything. Every trust. Every transfer. Every protection. Solicitors across London quietly withdrew their support. Gregory's influence diminished rapidly. Society moved on. It always did. Victoria Holloway disappeared from prominent social circles. Nathaniel Harrington relocated to the continent for an extended period. Their chapter ended without fanfare. Charlotte felt no satisfaction from their downfall. Only relief. Winter deepened. Then gradually softened into early spring. Wedding preparations filled every corner of Blackthorn House. Dressmakers arrived constantly. Guest lists expanded. Florists discussed impossible quantities of flowers. Charlotte discovered that planning an aristocratic wedding required military-level organization. Theodore endured the process with remarkable patience. At least publicly. One evening Charlotte found him hiding in the library. There you are. Theodore looked up from a book. I suspected you would find me eventually. Charlotte closed the door behind her. Mrs. Dawson has selected 6 different flower arrangements. Theodore nodded solemnly. A grave development. You are making fun of me. Never. Charlotte crossed the room and sat beside him. Comfortable silence settled between them. These moments had become her favorite part of every day. No grand declarations. No social obligations. Simply peace. Theodore reached for her hand automatically. The gesture felt so natural now that neither thought about it. Charlotte studied him for a moment. Why did you keep all the letters? Theodore looked genuinely surprised. Which letters? Mine. Understanding dawned immediately. He seemed almost embarrassed. I liked receiving them. Charlotte smiled. Every single one. Theodore hesitated. Then nodded. Every single one. Charlotte laughed softly. You were impossible. Theodore's gaze warmed. That is a strange criticism from someone who intends to marry me. The wedding took place on a bright April morning in a small chapel on the Blackthorn estate. Theodore insisted on keeping the ceremony intimate despite society's demands. Charlotte loved him more for it. Sunlight streamed through stained glass windows. Fresh flowers filled the air with delicate fragrance. Family, friends, and trusted companions gathered quietly. Mrs. Dawson cried before the ceremony even began. Barnes pretended not to. No one believed him. Charlotte stood at the chapel entrance holding a bouquet of white roses. Her heart raced. Not from fear. From joy. Pure, overwhelming joy. The chapel doors opened. She stepped forward. Theodore waited at the altar. For a moment the entire world seemed to disappear. No scandals. No secrets. No years of misunderstanding. Only this. The man who had protected her when she was frightened. Encouraged her when she doubted herself. Believed in her before she learned to believe in herself. The man who had remained when everyone else left. Theodore's expression changed as she approached. Charlotte recognized the look immediately. She had seen traces of it hidden inside journals written years ago. Love. Uncomplicated. certain, enduring. The ceremony passed in a blur of emotion. Then came the vows, the promises, the final blessing. And suddenly it was done. Husband and wife. The realization felt both extraordinary and inevitable, as though some part of their story had always been moving toward this moment. The reception occupied the gardens behind Blackthorn Manor. Guests mingled beneath spring sunshine. Laughter filled the air. Children chased one another across green lawns. Music drifted from a string quartet. Everything felt wonderfully alive. Late in the afternoon, Charlotte slipped away from the crowd. She wandered toward a quiet hill overlooking the estate. Rolling fields stretched across the countryside. Villages rested in the distance. The land her father loved. The land Theodore protected. Footsteps approached behind her. She smiled before turning around. Theodore joined her moments later. I wondered where you went. Charlotte looked across the landscape. I wanted to remember. Theodore followed her gaze. For several minutes neither spoke. They did not need to. Eventually Charlotte broke the silence. Do you know something strange? Theodore looked down at her. What? She smiled. For years I thought I was alone. Emotion flickered briefly across his face. Charlotte continued. I thought I had lost everyone who would ever truly see me. Theodore reached for her hand. Charlotte. She squeezed his fingers gently. Then I discovered the truth. The wind moved softly across the hilltop. Birds sang somewhere nearby. The world felt peaceful. Complete. Charlotte looked up at him. All those years. Her voice grew quieter. You were there. Theodore smiled. The expression carried 13 years of memories. 13 years of promises. 13 years of love hidden beneath duty. I promised your father I would keep you safe. Charlotte felt tears gather once more. Theodore touched her cheek gently. I never expected you would become the only home I ever wanted. The words settled between them. Simple. Honest. Perfect. Charlotte rose onto her toes and rested her forehead against his. Below them the estate stretched toward the horizon. Ahead of them lay an uncertain future. Yet for the first time neither uncertainty nor fear seemed important. They had survived loneliness. Secrets. Scandal. Years of silence. What remained was trust. Loyalty. Love earned slowly and honestly over time. The rarest gifts in the world. And as the afternoon sun bathed the English countryside in gold, Charlotte finally understood something her father had known all along. The greatest inheritance he left behind was never wealth. It was the man who had kept every promise.